Well, good morning. Welcome to Siesta Key Chapel. I'm Pastor Ruth, and it's a joy to be gathered together with you on a beautiful morning. Yes. So on November 8th, 1970, the first worship service of the Christian Fellowship was held, and it was next door at the out-of-door school, now Academy. And then in 1973, Siesta Key Chapel was incorporated by the state of Florida. And on March 30th, 1975, on Easter Sunday, God's Treehouse was dedicated to the glory of God. And the first architect was Frank Folsom Smith. He was present last year at Sarasota Architecture's Moderns That Matter. And Frank was joined then by architects James Durden and James Holliday. And James Holliday's son, Craig Holliday, is an active member of this congregation and also a founding member of the chapel. So the architectural vision was for a simple chapel in the woods near the ocean. Sounds nice. And to quote Frank Folsom Smith, our aim was to preserve the natural beauty of the site, setting up worshipful space in the rustic environment with room to grow into a community servant lifestyle as a neighborhood church. And this day, 50 years later, we host all the neighborhood groups. So NA and AA and ukulele and 4 Girl Scout troops and all the condo associations. It's truly a neighborhood church. So the out-of-door school was the first site where this congregation met while construction was going on. It had a tin roof. It was sort of an outdoor pavilion. And Reverend Blackwood, the first pastor and founding pastor, he would preach until the rain started. And when the rain started, it got so loud on that tin roof that he would just stop and say, everybody have coffee. And they would have coffee hour in the middle of the sermon until the rain stopped, and then he would finish preaching. So we hear the words of our forebears as the chapel took shape. Treading on cushiony pine needles and sand, you approach the building and circle round the many mounded clumps of palms and oaks on the way, some draped thinly with Spanish moss. And there, rising before you, is a high triangle, a tall vertical window with a slanting roof encircling the entire structure and shading the walkway around the chapel. You can imagine on Christmas Eve, we have candlelight and folks gather all the way around and light up those who are inside as they sing Silent Night. At the foot of the ramp, there is a gazebo, and it has a king post cross atop. And this was salvaged from the sea by a friend of Randy Wells from Mote Marine. And as you look upward right now, you'll see perforated metal lighting, handcrafted by members of the chapel. Siesta Key Chapel was one of 4 designs that won the 1976 Mercy Award by the Gold Coast chapter of the American Institute of Architecture. And the judges commented, "This building is good theology." Worship is at 10:30 a.m. on Sundays. All are welcome. Once we figure out the hurricane relief, we will go back to having chapel on the beach early Sunday mornings as well. We hope to see you in the future, and thank you for joining us all today.
I just got taller. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Pastor Ruth. Didn't have to cover any of that material. Appreciate it. It is a beautiful day, and we are so happy to be at Siesta Key Chapel. What I'm sure was a very cool idea 50 years ago turned out to be completely prescient given our last couple of months. And it is a wonderful place to be, and we're so happy that it's here and undamaged. I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming today. Your support is very important to this organization and to our disaster relief efforts. And I just want to remind everyone that all net proceeds of today and this weekend will be applied to our Preserving Sense of Place disaster relief initiative. I also want to thank our speakers for their flexibility in totally, I'm going to use the word, pivoting to go from one topic for this symposium to another for the resilience that I think will be a hopeful message for us all. And we also have sponsors who are very important to this organization and its support. So I want to thank our weekend sponsors, Jane and Bill Knapp. And because it is a beautiful day, I'd like to urge you to take our Southgate self-driving tour this afternoon, and that is brought to us by Michael Sanders and Company. So I think we're ready to go. Marty?
Well, good morning. I guess I'm taller too. Yeah, thank you. So I am going to make some comments. I apologize. Those of you who were last night, it's my PowerPoint from last night, but different set of comments. But I want to thank, I'll be introducing each of our speakers. After Helene, we had a lot of discussions about, can MOD happen? Should it happen? What's the right message? What's the right tone? And I think we decided it was great. We should be supporting our community and we should be supporting recovery efforts. And about the time we were making that decision, then we had to evacuate for Milton, right? So yes, you heard last night, if I never hear the word pivot again, it'll be too soon. But we did, and we're here, and our recovery efforts are underway. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Our mission, remember, is this bifurcated one of looking to the past to look forward. So it's about stewarding the legacy of the Sarasota School of Architecture. But the point I really want to make about stewarding that legacy is part of that is the physical preservation and conservation of cultural heritage, architectural heritage resources. But a big part of that are these sort of key principles that were introduced here in Sarasota. They didn't use the word sustainable and resilient in 1940, but that's exactly what they meant. I also shared with you all last night, how I got here. So I'm a hillbilly from Kentucky. Everyone knows that. My mother really is a coal miner's daughter. She really grew up in a holler not far from Loretta Lynn. But I grew up in Pikeville, Kentucky, which experienced some severe flooding in the 50s through the 70s. 1977 was a flood. The town was under about 10 feet of water. And I was, how old was I then? 6 years old. So about the time, even before that flood happened, already underway was the second largest earth-moving project in North America. It's called the Cut Through. And literally, the town that I lived in moved a mountain and rerouted a river to make itself more resilient. And I said last night, my formative years were, I heard the blasts for the rock, and my school bus would be in between those two giant trucks with rocks in them. So I think it was sort of ingrained in my DNA. I then I was in Venice, Italy. I studied for a year or two and witnessed the flooding of that city. And that's where I decided to focus on cultural heritage, was when I was living in Venice. The MOS project was already underway when I lived there. And then I really cut my teeth in disaster recovery as the Strategic Initiatives Manager at the World Monuments Fund, where I oversaw restoring a sense of place. Do you like that? The full circle moment for me. Yes, WMF sanctioned me reusing it. Like I said last night, what are they going to say? I came up with the name to begin with. So I guess we need to trademark that. I don't know if Carrie's in the room. But so this was the first of 66 churches in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans that was brought back online, and it served as basically a meeting space. FEMA had workshops there. And it's still used that way today. That was our kind of agreement with that church, was that it would be a sort of community center. And yes, that's a very young version of me on the end, and the guy with the funky shirt and the glasses is my father. The principles of the Sarasota School, when we met 2 years ago, December, as a board to develop a strategic plan, there was a lot of core principles, but we came up with environmentally responsive, experimental and innovative, and democratic and accessible. And I think those principles, when I say our legacy is about preserving the Sarasota School, it's these concepts that we're also preserving, not just the physical, although that's important, the physical manifestations of those principles. And we had these 3 focus areas, and you can see the last one was about climate and coastal adaptation. And as I said last night, the board was really focused on the fact that I'd spent 30 years on preserving modern architecture. The board was less focused on the fact that I'd also spent 20 years doing disaster recovery. And I said last night, again, I'll repeat it, here we are. We didn't think we'd have to employ my skill set there, but unfortunately, this is where we are. And this is the quote that I always use, you know how I feel about Philip Hansen Hiss, but I think that this idea that our built environment is really encapsulates our values as a community. And that's why we created the Moderns That Matter in the Sarasota 100. We've surveyed thousands of buildings last year. We had almost 600 nominations, and we developed this priority list with you, the community, in what matters. And one of those Moderns That Matter sites we're sitting in here today. Next spring, it was already underway. We were trying to be proactive. Now, unfortunately, we're being reactive, but we have a partnership with the Department of Interior and the National Park Service that will begin in the spring, certainly in earnest by July 1. The government moves a little slow, but okay, that's fine. We're gonna get there. The idea is to do a vulnerability assessment and to really understand what's really at risk, and then to how we make decisions. And the framework is called ADAPT. It's a framework that I developed at the National Park Service with a colleague. We've published about it. I've employed it in a couple of places, and we'll be testing it again here. And then we'll develop adaptation guidance measures. Again, we completely, restoring a sense of place is our new theme for this year's MOD Weekend. As I said to Anne, standing in her kitchen, we have these very meaningful conversations. It's usually at her kitchen sink. Sometimes there's a glass of wine involved, depending on the time of day. And I said, you know, the last 10 years of MOD has really been about focusing on documenting and raising the awareness of that early phases of the Sarasota School, right, from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. But maybe the next decade, because this is our second decade, is really about looking forward and how we, again, evoke those principles, how we evolve those principles of the Sarasota School, and how we use them to help us begin to adapt our community for climate changes and rising sea levels that's coming in the form, unfortunately, of these disasters. I also said, I've said to people before, like, after disasters, like, you panic, right? And when you panic, you either freeze or you begin to problem solve. And I said, you know, that we are such a fortunate community. I think that going from a transformative, how we make this vision, how we implement this vision is really important. But we are such a fortunate community. I mean, the intellectual capital that's in this room, that's in this community. We're creative, arts and culture, we're design forward. Like, we have all, if there's one community on this planet that can lead the way and how we should adapt and how we should build for this new era of climate, it's Sarasota. And so, like Sarasota has always had this disproportionate impact on the world, I want us to have a disproportionate impact in this arena, and that we're gonna lead the way with the partners that we have here. And so disaster recovery, we launched it. I think Anne said last night, I was with her in New York when Helene happened. I got a text at 5 a.m. from Max Strang, who's in Venice, Italy, saying, it was a photograph saying that the cabanas at Sanderling were gone. And that was a pretty sobering moment. But I immediately, relying on my experience with disaster recovery, particularly hurricane and flood recovery, began to put together the program. It's hard to know what's going to happen, but disaster has a sort of cycle to it, and I knew what this year was going to look like. So I took a deep breath and was like, let's get started, right? We were still very much in the response phase when we put this recovery program together. And to date, I've stood in a lot of living rooms. They weren't all private residences, but I've evaluated on-site, did assessments myself of about 24 properties since Helene. And working with homeowners, there's been a lot of tears and some hugs. But I think that it's been comforting for folks, it's been comforting for me, again, to see this sort of human resilience and that people to know that we're here as an organization to help. I also shared that a lot of the places that I visited, I knew the homes. I had never maybe been inside the homes. Some of them I didn't know. The Gibbon residence on Longboat Key, Christine Zadini, our Director of Research and Documentation, was with me. When I pulled up to it, I was like, wow, this is awesome, right? And the homeowners weren't there. They're in their young 90s, and I was working, their two sons reached out to us, and neighbor let us in the house. And Christine and I were sort of speculating. The neighbors didn't know who designed it. It clearly was architect designed. And as we looked around, let me see you can see this fabulous like living room that overlooks the bay of Sarasota. We determined, or I thought it was the Zimmermans, Ralph and William Zimmerman. Not a lot of houses survive of theirs, but this is similar to ones that were built in Lido Shores. And sure enough, I've got confirmation it was the Zimmermans, and it's a time capsule. I think this house probably in the end will be demolished, and I think one of the things we'll do is to document to mitigate that loss. So to try to capture as much. When I worked Katrina, for example, and I know Jenny Wolfe will be speaking, like in St. Augustine, we lost a lot of buildings that we didn't have good documentation on. So I think that's a really important thing that we're doing. This little cottage in Sanderling, it's the last one. Most of them have been replaced with larger, beautiful homes on the waterfront. This is 1952. It's very small structure. This is how close it is to the Gulf of Mexico. This is the living room with 4 foot of sand in it, but it has all of its original materials like the Pecky cypress roof, and they want to keep the house. So it's not been determined eligible for the National Register. That's one thing we're exploring, is that possible? And the determination of eligibility will allow them to maintain the house and not have to meet the so-called 50% rule, where if you spend over 50% of the assessed value, you have to bring the home up to code, right? So that's not going to be possible in this case. And so a determination of eligibility for the National Register will be important. We all know the Cocoon House also took on about 2 feet of water during Helene. And the Revere Quality House, I think previous and current owner and the Revere Quality House are in the room with us today. And so we had already as an organization digitally documented this home. The person who helped document is in the room with us today. We've done a paint analysis, a materials analysis, conservation study of the home, and the house flooded twice during Helene, close to about 3 foot of water, and then about 18 inches during Milton. And then, of course, the Sanderling Cabanas. Rudolph, there he stands, a young guy before he left to go to Yale to be the director of research. He did the master plan. He did not do the clubhouse, but he did do the cabanas that were there. They were actually listed on the National Register following the hurricanes in 2004, in part to keep them standing, because FEMA had asked that at least 1 unit or 2 units be demolished. And so we sprung into action after the storm and documented these properties. What remained, which wasn't much. And I think you all, as I said last night, this was not only my favorite place in Sarasota, this is my favorite place in all of Florida. I think it just epitomized the Sarasota School of Architecture in terms of bringing together design, natural environment, and views of the Gulf, that sort of thing. So this morning, what we're going to do, and I'm going to ask you, we're going to be intellectually vulnerable. We put this symposium together thanks to Chris Reed, who's going to be he is Harvard University, Stoss Landscape Urbanism in Boston and Los Angeles. He's going to be he's working with us in the spring. He's going to bring a group of students as part of a design symposium to reimagine our bayfront, where Marina Jax is. This was an area that was identified during our symposium last year. The Downtown Sarasota series is in need of help in terms of a public space, but it's also our first line of defense, if you will, when it comes to coastal resilience in our downtown area. So I called Chris and Jeff Huber, who works with Larry Scarpa at Brick Scarpa, And I said, we have to change our symposium theme. And I think within 36 hours, we had some new speakers, including I just met Nina Marie Lister, and we were able to put together. But what I want to say is that we're going to begin this conversation today, but this is obviously a long conversation that we need to be having. And there are going to be some big questions posed. The way we've designed the symposium today, you're going to be kind of that bifurcated mission. The first two speakers are going to be big picture ideas and looking at the urban scale. We're also thinking about scale and looking forward about how we continue, what does a resilient future look like and how do we get there? And then the last two speakers are really going to look more at existing buildings, how we're adapting, and how we're meeting like needs, kind of immediate needs in terms of recovery. So if it all sounds good, they're going to be fairly brief. If they're not, I told them I would cut them off, even though I haven't been brief at all. But anyway, it's my show, so suck it up. Okay, we're going to get started with Nina Marie Lister, and we'll see how it goes. We are going to take a little break so people can have some coffee, restroom, that sort of thing. So Nina Marie is a professor and graduate director of the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University, previously Ryerson University, where she also leads the Ecological Design Lab. In 2021, she was appointed a senior fellow of Massey College from 2010 to 2014. She was a visiting associate professor of landscape architecture and urban planning at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Her career has spanned private and public sector work, integrating ecological science and with planning and design. As both a researcher and a practitioner, she is founding principal of Planned Form, a creative design practice. Nina Marie's work focuses on the intersection of landscape infrastructure and ecological processes in urban areas. With that, let's welcome Nina.
Good morning. What a pleasure to be here. It's also a really refreshing and a little bit daunting to be asked to come from away to speak to you in a world of vulnerability. I so appreciate the invitation, Marty. Thank you. And thank you for also trusting an outsider to come in and talk about something that is fresh and raw and difficult, and at the same time, I hope, a way for us to find flourishing. Resilience isn't all a bad thing. I want to draw on some experience about how we're thinking about resilience differently that might also inspire, offer hope, help build agency, and help find some joy in times that are really difficult. And I also appreciate the opportunity to speak with people who are living in the moment where the experience for you is really emblematic of what's happening in many places around the world. And so the message is also that we're not alone in this. It's something that we share together. And redesigning for it needs creativity. And to be creative, we need the space to do that. So we're going to start a little bit of a tour about thinking about redesign. But we might also begin by thinking about what do we have to look backwards to, as Marty said, but also at the same time toggle between looking forward and looking back to help us orient ourselves. My work in my lab does three basic things. Overall, we try to connect people to nature in cities, very broadly. That's very put simply. But more specifically, we do it in three domains of practice. One is that we see landscape as an investment in a kind of infrastructure, in the way you would build with roads, bridges, pipelines, or sewers. We do it in landscape, the thing that is alive and that connects us. The way we do that is to look at a toolkit of what we might call blue and green infrastructure, living infrastructures that are connected to the ecological systems that support us, but also to the buildings that house us, to the places we love, to the places we call home. And the way that we do that is to unpack, understand, and to qualify what resilience means. Most of the work that I've done, both at Toronto and in Boston, some of it with Chris Reed at Harvard, is to really explore ways in which we move towards these tools of practice and what they look like in terms of the way we govern ourselves, and the way we build. I think the most important thing to say is that we're in a time of what appear to be competing crises. We have to decide which is worse, the climate, the extinction crisis, housing affordability. But they come down to three really simple ideas behind a polycrisis, a system of kind of cascading failures, you might say, and that they're intertwined and connected. They're not actually competing. And the sooner we can acknowledge that we are all facing these, the better we are in terms of building creatively, how to assess, document in many cases, find funding, and most of all, find the hope and energy to rebuild and recover. And those three basic pillars, I think, are really exceptional to acknowledge. And we put them into plain language that everyone understands, that the evidence is around us, we see it. To what we attribute it might differ, but we're facing these three things. We're facing crises of global heating, some people call it climate change, a biodiversity crash, a loss of nature, some call it extinction. And most probably importantly for all of us, the way they intersect is through human suffering. We are vulnerable to these losses and these phenomena. And so helping to frame it as a case of human suffering allows us to identify with one another and to work together to solve the problem. And we know the problems are big. Rather than inundating you with what you already know, what I would say is a step back and look continentally and even globally at what we are doing about these things. And we know most basically, particularly standing here in a low-lying and incredibly beautiful area where the sky touches the sea, that we are seeing a sea level rise potential between 1 and 6 feet in the next century. You experience it in punctuated, powerful moments here. And we also know that these are really expensive problems. Just in 2023 alone, so last year, $23 billion events across the United States alone, and that's not including Canada and wildfires and all the rest of it. So this is just in the continental United States. So we know it's a really expensive problem. And even if we still debate about what causes it or why, we know it's ongoing. But importantly, we're not alone. These images in a really quick succession remind us that we are suffering through these in many places around the world at the same time. And so in a weird and strange way, we have a toolkit. We can look around to see what are others doing? What are the ways we might not only learn from others, but actually lead? And because you are a powerful community, and I heard this term, which I'm really going to take away, Marty, you have philanthropic moxie. And you have creativity. And when you have that kind of collectivity, you have the potential to not be alone, but to lead. So whether you're talking about mudslides in Libya, or incredible, horrendous flooding in New Delhi and Mumbai, or recently in Valencia, Spain, where these are, 1,000-year storms, some are saying, or even in Vermont on the border with Canada, as we're finding our way out of our houses by canoe, or in my own city of Toronto, where 3 times in the last decade we've had our 100-year storm, which no longer means anything, shutting down our major roads. So the evidence is really abundant, just in the way we live and experience, that we know climate resilience needs to reset the way we think, to retool our kits, and to recover by redesigning. And it doesn't mean replacing necessarily. It doesn't necessarily mean retreat, run away. It means recovering. And part of that is healing. It's the ability to plan ahead, not just for something that we think is predictable or certain, but to adapt and to be nimble and agile, which requires energy. And the design for resilience requires that creativity I spoke about. So I'm asking all of us to think about, as I'm sure you are every day, what does a climate resilient future look like? And perhaps more importantly, how does it feel to us? Certainly there's vulnerability and fear of what we don't know, but when we look to the expanded range of possibilities that we haven't tried before, or let's frame it this way, if we stop using the tools that got us into trouble in the first place and try for a different set, that's where our creativity becomes unlocked. And I'd offer too that as we go forward, we could ask questions about how redesigning, that is to say, our processes of governance, of decision-making, of collective action, of individual pursuits even, how can we build resilience and recovery at the same time as we are recovering and building our communities, our places, our civic places that perform for us, that protect and support us ecologically, socially, economically. And that at the same time, these are civic places that deserve to be beautiful, and they ought to be joyful. These things are not in opposition when they're done properly. So maybe it helps us to unpack a little bit the ideas of what we mean by resilience. This word is so often used and frankly abused. It's distorted a little bit, essentially meaning that, well, it just means to get the lights turned on again, which on day one, after a terrible event, that's what we want to do. But beyond that, it means something else. And I'd say that there are really kind of 6 broad reasons that we talk about why are we using this term resilient. And the first is that more of us live in cities than ever before, so we're changing the way we develop and move on the surface of the planet, and that rise has particular importance for groups of people. But also that much of our infrastructure on which our success has been built is literally falling apart and decaying across North America. Bridges, roads, pipelines, sewers, and without that kind of reinvestment, it's going to look different. It needs to be different. The other reason is that we have a better understanding of how living and environmental systems work. Ecology is a science in which I guess I have my discipline and my own training. We've seen change dramatically in 25 years to understand that flexibility, adaptability, dynamic conditions are actually normal. So how do we live within them? We, of course, tend to like things to be static. We hear the words preserve and protect and guard. And those are good things to have, but they have to happen within an envelope of living systems that are changing. Similarly, the reality of the climate, of global heating, is upon us. To whatever we attribute it, it's around us and we see it happening, so we can't run away from it. And at the same time, we're losing the very stuff, the material quality that actually protects us from some of these events. And that's the natural world itself. That is our best investment because it's all around us if we choose to use and engage with it differently. And then finally, I've already mentioned it, but we're seeing our vulnerability increase. So these are all good reasons to use this idea and to figure out what it means. So forgive the text-heavy images, but these are really taking a moment and a breath to think, well, let's qualify what we mean by resilience. If it's not just getting the lights on, or what does it mean to get back to normal when the ground plane has shifted out from under you, when normal looks different, when the conditions that made the thing you love and are hanging on to are different? So it means we react differently. It also means that, yes, we have to be adaptable, but let's use some of the psychosocial traits that are identified in resilience. And actually, interestingly, all of the ideas on this screen come from the US military. They're very familiar with what the word resilience from a person's point of view must feel and look like. And it's deeply psychological. The ability to deal with stress, to recover in the face of adversity, to bounce back to normal. That green dot, that's the one that gets used by all of our sloganeering around resilience, is just get back to normal as quickly as possible. But of course, when the world is changing quickly around you, the normal looks different. How are you going to maintain that well-being and that sense of wellness under these conditions that can be extremely stressful? Hard to talk about this in a room when you've all just gone through this. You're in these stages, so it's really understanding that these are all part of the psychological makeup that give us the tools, actually, to manage. And I would qualify this a little further to say that we might ask ourselves, each of us individually may have a different answer, but how much change is okay for us, psychologically, economically, in our well-being? How are we coping with this idea that normal looks different? And then I'd offer that the capacity to absorb stress is one thing. We know we need this, and disturbance, and even to reorganize ourselves, as you've all been doing over the past month. We have to continue to function, but maybe the thing to think about is not in the same way as before. We need to do some things differently. And a model of health is good. After an injury or an operation, we recover, but really constitutionally and physically, we're never exactly the same. In some ways, we're better. In some ways, we've learned to adapt or be different. So the key is, and I like that Marty's already used this word, it's transformative, not just adaptive. In some cases, we actually need to transform. And that doesn't mean losing the things we love. It means engaging with them differently. So revising an idea of resilience, Brian Walker's terms, this is from a large symposium on resilience a long time ago. We really thought about what this is, and it's learning, really, how to change. Resilience is learning how you can change so that you are not changed yourself. In other words, it's being active, not so reactive, but taking the situation to say, I need to learn how to change in order not to be changed by force or by consequence. And we can do that with design. The good news is we do have tools to think about this differently. This term has been around a long time. You've no doubt heard in the last decade that the Rockefeller Foundation funded a program called 100 Resilient Cities that pretty much turned in some places into just getting the lights back on as quickly as possible and not much more. In other cases, that fundamentally changed the way they made planning and design decisions. We know that this has evolved to the point where the American Society of Landscape Architects began to think about how do we connect the built world and the natural world in ways that actually help us build resilience, understanding that our architecture doesn't sit in a vacuum. When I looked at the origins of the Sarasota School, with which I was not terribly familiar, it was all about the natural environment in which the buildings sit, how they engage, how the sea touches the sky, where your view goes, and these beautiful buildings that are an expression of the relationship to landscape. That's the powerful connection that in some cases has been lost. And we know this from work in resilient cities in particular, where we're trying to understand how each recipe for redesign looks different based on the landscape from which the architecture emerges. Small things. Sometimes we look very small at how can we do the smallest thing differently? What about a curb cut that allows water to move differently? These examples are all coming from public work, a practice in Toronto that's engaged with the redesign of our waterfront simply because they're familiar and they're not particularly unique to place, but the materials might be. So just thinking about how water moves through a curb cut differently, or if we reimagine the sidewalk differently at times of dryness or wetness. And these are very gentle interventions in some way. They can be beautiful. They can create thriving and flourishing places. Places that are sometimes wet, sometimes dry, sometimes they have silt intrusion. And we know these small-scale ideas are common around the world. They look elegant in some places, vernacular in others, but we know that even the International Panel on Climate Change has recognized that our cities and wellness are intersecting around ideas of climate. And we know that this includes materials for building in landscapes. In fact, the United Nations recognizes that the natural world itself, biodiversity, the diversity and abundance of species on Earth, is actually our best already existing natural defense against climate change. In fact, the executive secretary recognizes that, well, climate change is the largest driver of losing species, but it also depends on the natural world. So these two things are fundamentally intertwined. And what that means for landscape and architecture is that the services of life on which we depend are fundamentally connected. What we call the supporting, provisioning, cultural, and regulating services of the planet. Culture is in there, right? It's not separate. So some of these images should ask us to rethink, how do we engage with civic spaces in our cities, on the water? And we know that globally, this is being talked about at multilateral and multinational, international levels of governance, whether it's the climate COPs that are happening right now in Azerbaijan, or last month's what's called Nature COP now, Biodiversity Summit in Colombia. Even at the UN Habitat Conference, they recognize that the natural world, landscapes that sustain us, are an incredibly important part of the architecture of cities, the way we build houses. These ideas of culture and nature are being reconnected, reaffirmed, and redesigned. So I asked the question, again, in this way in my research lab, if we know that resilient systems are also adaptive, they are connected, social and ecological systems, they're not separate. So then how do we reconnect? How do we think about redesign in a way that reconnects, protects the ecosystems and the landscapes, and by extension, the architecture that supports us? So how do we design for resilience? That's the major question in my research lab and my practice. And we explore ways with designers to use scaled up solutions, or I actually prefer to think of it as scaling across, from the small curb cut and the bioswale to whole streets that look different, removing the kind of linear pathway that we think of from car to transit to a pedestrian walkway, to some of this threading through and connecting, where we're providing heating, amelioration, shading and cooling and drainage, places that slow and hold and soak water, that are also civic places for pride and for beauty. And most of all, the recognition that there are times when people need to slow, stop, and rest, just as the water does. And our public spaces on waterfronts might look and feel very different if we engage with them differently. So let's think about the toolkit and resetting our expectations that our infrastructure is more than gray. It's not just building seawalls and storm sewers, although that's part of it, but we're also thinking about the living landscape itself in a way that's blue and green, that's slowing, holding, and cleaning water for us at the right times, filtering it quickly at the other times. But at the same time, it's connecting and protecting the natural world. It does these two things together. Oh, and wait, it does a third. If we do it really well, it ought to be beautiful. It ought to be joyful, and it should create flourishing places, more than just surviving and even thriving. We ought to be flourishing, and we can use design to do this. So when we imagine what our future cities look like here, a vision becoming a reality in a very flooded area in Toronto and the North Shore of the Great Lakes, we can have a community where the park and the river actually shape the city, sometimes at low water, sometimes at high water, where our pedestrian walkways, our bicycle ways are also greenways and corridors that drain and hold and soak water. Public transit is somehow still in there, so is the private automobile, just more reduced. And different modes of transportation are abundant on the water. So let's think about the landscape itself as a resilient infrastructure and a frame for the architecture into which we insert. Connected and protected is one thing. If you connect, you can protect. Water and land together, not separately, but water and land together, multifunctional, as a frame for design, and that these ideas are scalable. These tools can work from the level of the curb cut to the building block, to the neighborhood, to the city, to the region. And that the assets we have are multifunctional. Let's think about co-benefits, not just designing for one thing when you can have three. Right? That's good design. Good design does that for us. And of course, they're performative landscapes. They perform these tasks that we need them to do in times of disaster, and even before that, long before that. And they can be natural, sure, but they're also designed. We can design with and on nature. And we can do this in a way that's healthy. We know increasing research, a whole other sector of this research, is about our own mental health and physical well-being that are connected to these benefits. Our stress levels go down measurably, our cortisol levels are reduced 15 minutes in a landscape that is layered and lush. Increases our attention span. That's also amazing. And then finally, I'd argue that resilience, when it's done this way, is pragmatic. Yes, but it's also poetic. It's beautiful. It's a place for civic pride and engagement. So this is a future vision for my own city, one that was industrial and flooded 3 times to the historic norm in the last decade. And part of that is heavy infrastructure, building and seawalling, yes, but also a river that's alive, a new river that's restructured the city. This is the removal of a plug that's allowing the new river to flow again. And while it's flowing, by the way, it's making 6 new parks, not by itself, but shaping and creating those places for movement, engagement, and joy. And all along this edge is a very different kind of engagement with the downtown core of a city that's possible across North America, where we once treated our rivers this way, and it was only public engagement that demanded more. We now think that there's a combination of the landscape, the architecture, and the civic realm, because that's how we co-create, and that's how we do more than just survive. We thrive, build agency, build hope, and co-create resilience. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nina Marie. Next, we have Chris Reed. Chris is the founding director of Stoss Landscape Urbanism in Boston and LA, where he leads the design and content of each of the firm's project. As a designer, researcher, strategist, teacher, and advisor, Chris is recognized internationally as a leading voice in the transformation of landscapes and cities, and was a recipient of the 2012 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Landscape Architecture. While running STOS and its projects, Chris is also a professor in practice of landscape architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. His commitment to teaching is not only a way to develop the next generation of landscape architects, but also keep STOS on a constant quest for new ways of seeing, thinking, and doing, which has helped put the firm at the forefront of the profession. He has an AB in Urban Studies from Harvard and a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Chris and I met 2019, 2020, right as COVID happened. I was co-leading an effort on Nantucket. It was the first Envision Resilience Challenge. If you don't know this, they're on their 5th iteration of the Envision Resilience Challenge. It's now becoming its own nonprofit. That brought together 5 schools to reimagine what downtown Nantucket might look like in 2100 when it was flooded. So those of you who sort of tracked the New College Challenge, it was based on that model. So it's been my pleasure to get to work with Chris, and we look forward to working with you in the spring. Chris.
Good morning. It's great to be here. Thank you, Marty, for putting this together. Thanks for the invite. I hope you realize what a treasure you have in Marty. He's quite a dynamo, as you know. I want to thank Marty and Anne and the board for supporting this kind of work and supporting the work that we'll be doing with students in the spring at Harvard around issues of resilience here in Sarasota. I'm going to talk to you today about the role of landscape, really building a lot on what Nina Marie has just laid out for you. I want to talk about that role of landscape and landscape or green infrastructure, green-blue infrastructure. I tackle it from the standpoint of being a designer, looking at planning and design and implementation of projects at various scales. And for me, the question here is, how is it that landscape can help to deal with and adapt to the multitude of climate challenges we're all facing? We work at the site scale to the regional scale. Water doesn't behave by jurisdictional boundaries. It doesn't care who owns what plot of land. It's going to go where it goes, right? We need to deal with how these systems work and the scales that they work at. Last time I gave a public talk in Sarasota, it was just a few weeks after Hurricane Ian. That one was happenstance. It was a pre-scheduled event. And I feel like I'm coming to this community at extreme moments of vulnerability. And I come as an outsider. I've not quite experienced the kind of event and loss that you've experienced, and I acknowledge that. So it's difficult work. We work a lot with communities like yours. Oftentimes we work in advance, but sometimes also after an event has happened. And what we try to do is bring a sense of humility to that work, but also try to lend the kind of expertise that Nina Marie was just talking about in order to help communities reimagine what the future can be. And with that, I hope to bring a sense of optimism, that there are good solutions out there. They can be beautiful, they can be wonderful. There's some work to be done, but that's what we're here to do. Looking at a different event, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, this is one that really kind of hit people and started a conversation about how to deal with resilience and particularly what the impacts are on communities. The image on the right hand, this is part of a canal system, part of their flood defense system. That's a broken flood wall. And you all know the disaster that ensued once a couple of those walls failed. The flood wall is hard. I'm going to throw out a couple terms here because I'm going to come back to it. It's hard. It's a hard piece of infrastructure. It's static. It doesn't move, right? It's one that's singular. It has one function to protect against flooding, right? And it works to resist the forces that are out there. It does not work with them. That's what happens when that system fails, right? Complete disaster. There's no backup system. It's not multifunctional. In fact, that whole canal and flood system is separating the community that you see flooded from the community on the other side. So it has real lasting implications, not only on the environmental fabric, on the individual property, but on a sense of community as well. But that's not the only force that we're facing. Stormwater flooding, river flooding, rising seas. The image on the right from my hometown, Boston. This is the king tide. This happens once every month or two on a regular basis, where certain parts of the city now are overtopped with water. Seems cool as a kid, but it's something that everybody's kind of looking at in very, very serious ways. But we also deal with the opposite effect. Places that don't have enough water, that are experiencing extreme drought, lack of water. Oftentimes drought then leads to wildfire, and we're getting more extreme wildfire events. All these things, in addition to urbanization, are also causing the biodiversity crisis that Nina Marie talked about. Heat's rising, you feel that here, right? Heat in cities is especially rising. And those sorts of effects have disproportionate effects on lower income, socially vulnerable communities as well. Not everybody is able to leave the place that they're in. And so there's a real social ethical problem here that climate change is causing as well. As landscape architects and urbanists, we're trying to deal with all of these things simultaneously, right? It's a lot to deal with, but there is hope. We can always ask, what do you do in this environment? I mean, even the geese are a little riled up. This, by the way, is the parking lot of a supermarket in East Boston that, again, regularly overtops. So building on what Nina Marie said, I want to put out there that we need to think, work, and design differently. Rather than hard edges, we need to think about soft edges and the role that landscape can play. Rather than dealing with static systems, we need to engage the dynamics that are out in the environment. Rather than dealing with singular solutions, we need to look at multifunctional and multi-layered solutions. And rather than working against or resisting the forces out there, we need to work with and adapt those. What I'm going to do today is show you some examples of that, not because I think any one of them is particularly apt for what you're doing, but because they represent this kind of thinking that might help us to be a little bit more resilient as we go forward. And so what does this look like and how might it work? I'll take you through a number of projects to the site scale, to the very large site scale, to the city and regional scale as well. And a lot of this is coming out of our practice from across the country. Start with a very small project. You think it's a daunting issue, but site by site by site, you can make important improvements. This is a 1/4 acre site in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Notice how flat and level the site is. There's a bulkhead wall that separates the site from the river that you see there. You can see on the right-hand side a little bit, this site sits at the confluence of 3 rivers in the city of Milwaukee. This used to be vibrant, lush wetland here, as those rivers then emptied into Lake Michigan. Vibrant, lush wetlands have a function of holding water when there's too much water, when there are flood conditions. These rivers have all been channelized, the land has been flattened. It causes a whole series of problems in terms of exacerbating the effects of flooding. And so we were asked to do a couple things. We were simply asked to create a space of a small park at this confluence, but we decided to take on some of the environmental challenges that the site was encountering, particularly around the issue of flooding. To do so, we had to resculpt the landscape. That flat landscape now steps and terraces down, and you can see it ends in a beautiful wetland, which is a nod to the wetland that once existed there. This little animation shows you a little bit about how that works. By cracking the surface, we're able to think about how stormwater could go into the ground rather than simply running off with pollutants and silts into the river, right? So the ground is now absorbing water rather than the river. And the fact then that water can move over the land down to the lower areas, or in fact, when the river rises, that the project gives it more space, it lets water into that site. Both those conditions mean that the effects of the flooding on the river itself are lowered, right? And so quarter-acre site, it's not doing that much, but you start to add 2 and 5 and a dozen and 100 of these projects together, and you're going to start to have projects that really add up. They also provide beautiful places, right? This is a kind of landscape, a kind of habitat that does not exist anymore along the riverfront. It's great habitat, it's great biodiversity, but it's also a great place for people to hang out, have a glass of wine, there's a restaurant next door, and just to enjoy the environment, right? And so, yeah, it's serving a lot of climate purposes. That may not be the thing you're thinking about while you're there, and that's kind of the point. But the fact that you can enjoy this constantly changing environment really is the point of being there. We do this a lot. We try to engage dynamics. This is a project on the Boston waterfront. And by engaging dynamics, I mean anything from tidal fluctuations here and thinking about mussel gardens to how resilient landscapes can begin to deal with ever-increasing storm levels. When I talk about multiple edges, not single edges, this is what I'm talking about. The idea that as water rises, there are stages of flooding and that you can design for that flooding. When I talk about being multifunctional, the fact that it can deal with flooding, but this being at the aquarium is also an educational tool. It provides biodiversity, it provides public realm, right? So it's doing multiple things now and it has multiple edges. It's really enriching the environment that it's around. One of our biggest projects in Boston is a 90-acre park on the waterfront, Mowgli Park. It's surrounded, as you see, by urban neighborhoods. It's super flat. It's kind of underutilized in a lot of ways. You can see how level, this is pretty much the topography in the entire park. It's kind of overused park right now and needs a refresh anyway. Boston did a regional study to look at all the points of flooding as sea levels rose, and you can begin to see the piece that's labeled site here, that right across that is one of the primary flood paths. That water will invade the neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent, which happen in this case to be lower income public housing communities, but it's connected to a number of flood paths that not only flood a broader region, but connect behind higher land and flood part of the seaport up there as well. But it's not just water from the ocean that we're dealing with rising groundwater. We're dealing with compacted soil that can't absorb the increasing amount of rainfall that comes with every rainstorm now. And so as much as we're talking 30 years out about coastal flooding, the residents say, we can't play in these fields now because they flood every time it rains. If you look at the history of the site, you say, of course it floods. That orange jelly bean shaped thing up top shows you that this site was once mudflat and salt marsh. It was filled land, right? Again, taking away some of those dynamic edges that protect against flooding in favor of creating first a landfill and then a park. Our project is to design a resilient park that becomes a new destination park for the city, and to do it using a series of layers. Starting from the beachfront, the idea of a beach nourishment project that's then backed up by dune restoration, that's then backed up by a new kind of coastal landscape that has a whole series of hills, planted hills that really kind of feel like the natural shoreline. All of this, you can't quite tell, is rising in elevation to this blue line. That blue line represents the flood wall that's buried beneath a landscape berm. You never know that's there, right? But all of those systems, multiple layers of systems, are designed to protect that entire area against flooding. This is where landscape can really be put to work in useful ways. This is a model that starts to abstract that, shows how it works a little bit. First, during rainstorms, you'll see within the park on the left that lower areas start to fill up with water. But then you'll see as water is invading from the ocean that this entire territory can become flooded. Here you begin to understand where that flood berm is and how that's protecting against the thing, the areas behind it as well. And then the water goes away, and then you can recover that part of the open space. So then we look at, okay, what are the effects of this? This is a view looking over the park as projected. And then we look at what the effects are, how that water can be contained to an edge, and then how other systems for stormwater can be put in place behind the berm to deal with some of the regular stormwater flooding. What that allows for is some really wonderful spaces. In the middle of this coastal landscape, you have this great plaza with water fountains, great place to hang out. That becomes an amphitheater for events, but it's also the place that helps to defend in terms of the coastal storm. Right? And then the water goes away, and you can begin to reconstitute that activity. That's a large site. You can do this on small sites. That's a public project. This is a private development project. It's an older industrial site, right? New development, historic resources, and we're designing a landscape that's designed, again, to flood at various stages. This animation was picked up by a local TV station because it's one of the few that shows as seas rise and fall, as you experience storm surge, how the landscape can kind of absorb those flooding levels, and then as the water begins to recede, restore a sense of what the kind of social and ecological dynamics are. That's a proposed project. This project in Wisconsin actually does that and has been proven to be a great floodable space. So 50 feet wide, not a wide corridor as well, new kind of riverfront open space. On the one hand, that was the primary goal, to bring a sense of joy and community to a place that was previously a rail line and filled with parking lots, offering opportunities to get down to the Fox River. There are a couple different resilient strategies here. One is to absorb stormwater, and you can see how the pavements are designed to actually allow water to collect water and to allow it to infiltrate, again, into the groundwater rather than running off immediately into the river. And second, by changing the grade, all of this happening underneath this bench, we're able to achieve FEMA flood levels and protect all of downtown from river flooding here. A lot of work's happening between that one set of benches. Here you can see the linear boardwalk. That red line is the flood protection. It exists under the benches. You'd never know it's there, right? And then other areas are designed to allow for incremental flooding over time. Photograph during a big event on the waterfront. There again, the red line is that flood line with different levels of flooding. And this is what happened just a couple of years ago. The river came up. It started flooding some of those same areas. 2-3 weeks later, after the river went down, the community recovered, new celebratory event. So these multifunctional landscape spaces, they can be hard or soft in many ways, but the idea that they're multifunctional and designed to flood or designed to live with water is really important. Heat's another issue, and I know you all deal with heat down here as well. We've been working out in LA with a consortium of consultants, universities, public and private, and nonprofit entities, looking at the LA Tree Equity Initiative, particularly in neighborhoods that have low canopy cover and certain levels of social vulnerability. It's getting hotter in LA as it's getting here. And so the question is, what is the role that trees can play just in providing shade and cooling down the environments, right? This, again, is only within the public right-of-way that the city already owns and controls. So in this particular place, what we're doing is working with communities looking at small and more intensive ways in which that we might begin to deal with heat by introducing new trees and by introducing green infrastructure to collect stormwater. In this case, we're just looking at not changing the street at all, but expanding what's happening on the edges to introduce a few new trees that'll have some effect, but not a huge effect on the environment. But we're also giving communities toolkits to say there are other ways to transform these streets as well. If we move away from thinking about automobiles first and we begin to think about people first, we can begin to think about vegetated medians, expanded areas for trees on the edges, and suddenly you begin to transform that environment in very functional ways, but also in very beautiful ways as well. These trees and these tree pits are capturing stormwater, they're providing shade, they're providing habitat, but they're also just beautiful and transformative as well, right? And so bringing this kind of beauty, this kind of function to communities that need it most is really the point of this work. Second project, similar kind of neighborhood, this one a little bit more commercial, different widths, and all that. Again, a more minimal approach here, looking at edges and sidewalks and a pocket park on the side, and a more maximal approach, again, where we think about shared bike lanes, green infrastructure, and really transforming what that place can look like. Projects like this, which are considered part of urban forestry initiatives, can also happen at the site level. Recently, we've worked with the city of Cambridge on an innovative project, the first of a kind there, to demonstrate some of the principles of their urban forestry plan, how to replant the city with many, many different trees, different species of trees, and different increased quantity of trees. The site is Triangle Park. On the left-hand slide, it's the bottom red triangle, and you can see the neighborhood it was in 1995. Parking lots, a few industrial facilities, super hot, no open spaces. We were commissioned to design 3 of those sites. You can see how in 2024 that neighborhood's been transformed quite dramatically with a lot of development. A lot of research, a lot of business development there, but the city put in place a network of these smaller open spaces in order to provide well-needed open space to the community that's there to the right and also to the new community coming in. This particular project sits on what was once tidal riverland. You can see the different edges over time. The idea that the Industrial Revolution started to fill some of those tidal flats, that the area was channelized, and the triangle that we're dealing with at one point was heavily industrialized as a fuel facility for trucks coming and going and moving through the area. So there was a lot of remedial work to do in terms of contaminated land. But the idea that we could transform this leftover triangle of space between roadway infrastructure into something that was really designed both for people and for the planet was really important. Here we were innovating. So usually on 1 acre of land, you could plant anywhere from 12 to 50 trees. 50's a lot. We planted 400 trees, right? And the idea being that if one of those trees dies out, it's not such a big deal, right? Because there are 399 other trees there ready to grow in its place. We also radically expanded the diversity of plant communities. In 10 years, we're not quite sure how hot it's going to be, and we're not sure what the microclimate is going to be within the specific area. So instead of planting 2 species, we planted 24 species. And again, some of those are going to do beautifully. Some might not, but that's okay, right? This is kind of how the forest works, right? That, trees that are better adapted to that particular condition end up flourishing. And so to have a city take on this idea and begin to kind of deal with that kind of scenario making, if you will, that sense of we're not quite sure, but let's pad in a lot of extra trees and extra effort here and see what happens is pretty radical. You begin to see how some of those small trees grow rather quickly. That was one of the other innovations, is we're planting a lot of bare root trees that are probably not much higher than I am, with the idea that they would grow quickly over time and slowly either die out or be culled out by the city arborist in order to, again, make sure that the stronger trees had the conditions that would best suit them. You can also again see how we're dealing with stormwater, allowing it to infiltrate the ground, and also at the point of the triangle, creating a lowland forest there to collect stormwater. Those are the little guys. You see some, I would say, teenage trees to the right, and then you see one of the, what's that, a middle-aged tree? To the left that was on site. So we're trying to look at trees at different sizes, trees at different ages, and also in doing so, create a barrier to the really heavy automobile traffic that's just next door. Again, here maintaining existing trees, adding in layers and layers and layers of trees and vegetation around the edges in order to create a really beautiful space. Of course, people are really important. When the city came to us and said, we want a forest, we said, sure, but it needs to include people. It's about it being in the city. It's about people being able to experience the beauty of nature and the change that happens. So we very deliberately designed it for people to come, to sit, to hang out. There's a clearing in the middle that's really quite nice. That berm is there, again, to screen out some of the traffic behind it. A series of seat walls and lawns on the upper edge, a deck that can be used as a stage where the kid is hanging out, and then a central area which will grow into a really beautiful cafe grove over time. Great place for a kid to just kind of explore the city, right? But be in a space that's now healthier for people and healthier for the environment. And a place that, again, hopefully inspires joy. As well. This is the only photograph you'll ever see where I'm in the background. I was not meant to be in the background, and I was really mad that the photographer got it, but it's such a good photograph. That's my daughter on the right-hand side and her bestie on the left. So again, 1 acre. Now we're talking city-making scale, right? I'm going to shift 2 more projects. This is down in the Caribbean, and we were asked to design a resilient city on a tropical island on the site of a former airport. As landscape architects, we're leading this team. It's not an architect, it's not an urban designer, it's an engineer. It's the landscape architect that's leading the team because we can synthesize all the expertise that all those other disciplines are bringing and create something that's more responsive to the environment. I'm also proud of this project. This was a 4-year open international design competition that we recently won. And so starting in January, we're going to go down and actually start to design this to further level of detail and implement it. That's the site. We started reading the brief. It's the former international airport. And the brief said, okay, we have big storms, there's lots of rain, we have hurricanes a lot. We also have sea level rise, storm surge that you need to deal with. This is lowland edge. We have earthquakes, and we have an active volcano. And we kind of said, you know, great, everything but the plague. And then COVID happened. They actually had a volcanic eruption, too, during the competition. It was an ash event, not a lava event. But on a small island community like this, that kind of event, as you're experiencing, really sets the community back in many ways. And so we're trying to grapple with all of these earthquakes. You know, it's hard to prevent earthquakes. As a landscape architect, I'm not even in a church. I'm not going to tell you I have that power. I don't. Part of the project, of course, is figuring out a new urbanism, a new small town that's developed. And normally this is the kind of thing that you would expect from urban designers and architects and all that. And there's some real thought put into new kinds of residential and workforce housing and cultural centers and sports and all that. That's really important. But these are the diagrams that really make the project work. Plan on the left, showing essentially this linear arrangement of buildings along the old runway. We wanted a kind of sense of the heritage of the place. But you can begin to see how some of the lines start to go up into the hills. The image on the right is really what is the green infrastructure and resilience plan that helps to shape the project from the start. On the lower right, you have a river. That river's degraded, it floods regularly, it erodes because it has too much water coming through it and it's going through too narrow a channel. On the bottom edge, you have a coastal issue with the potential for storm surge. On the upper side, you can see these green fingers that are coming down from the mountain valleys are also bringing water to them, and somehow that needs to be dealt with, intercepted before it floods the new urban fabric. You then have the condition of the runway itself, which is really hot, right? And so our plan starts to deal with all four of those. Along the river corridor, we're looking at hard and hybrid and soft conditions in order to reconstitute what the banks of that river are. We're reintroducing biodiversity. We're reintroducing a layered landscape using some reinforced gabion. Gabions are rocks and stones in cages that deal well with flooding, but also allow other things to grow through them. We're adding in bike paths and walking paths and places for people to enjoy these environments. And you can see by some of those lines there that this is designed to deal with some of the increasing levels of flooding that we know now will happen, but it can also deal with future levels of flooding that we can't quite predict. On the upper side, where those green fingers are coming down into the city, we're taking this as an opportunity to design green canals that capture that water, have vegetation to clean that water, but really create a kind of island version of the Amsterdam canals, right, that allow us to create a new kind of environment there. And then finally, the water's edge here. A layered system that builds on some of the mangrove forests that are already there, but also allows for people to kind of access this new waterfront. Those layers of boardwalk step up to create new elevations that protect, but you can see allow for flooding, allow for the planting of new mangrove gardens that can help, again, in the coastal environments. And then on the runway, creating this incredibly lush and social landscape, super shaded, using a lot of water, fountains, mist to cool the environment and to create this lush and shady environment out of one of the spaces that's most exposed. In all of these projects, we're looking at ways to really deal with the forces that are in play, to engage some of those forces, to recognize those, to figure out what are some of the challenges that are ahead. How is it that landscape and hybrid green solutions can help us deal with these? How can they bring a new sense of sociability to the place? How can they involve folks like you in planning and designing the future of the environment? These are designs that don't just come from us, but come out through heavy community engagement, heavy discussion, look at the flood threats, convert them to opportunities, new kinds of water boulevards, new kinds of green spaces that can really deal with and absorb the same kind of effects of flooding and hurricanes and climate change that you're all dealing with. So whether it's a small project at a small site, or a larger project that covers a 27-mile island, there are ways in which resilient landscape strategies, soft solutions, right, going back to the list, soft solutions, dynamic solutions, multifunctional solutions that work with and adapt to the forces in play, can help us imagine a new future. Embracing change is the key, right? There's hope out there for you. There's a beautiful, equitable, resilient future for Sarasota. It's just waiting for you to kind of grasp it. Thanks.
want to thank all of our sponsors. I also want to thank the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Sarasota County, which manages the Tourism Development Cultural Arts Grant. For the first time, Architecture Sarasota received a grant to help support, specifically support our advertising of MOD. So if you're here from the Alliance today, thank you so much for your support. And you know, we set some metrics, by the way, of outside guests, so also be a little lenient with us. And that it was really a challenge, right, to advertise MOD since we didn't know it was happening until 11 days before. But anyway, we made it happen. So thank you again to Nina Marie and Chris, who did an amazing job. Again, that's the sort of regional landscape, urban scale, thinking about, we really have to completely rethink how we approach design of our landscapes, particularly in places like Sarasota and coastal settings. The next two speakers are more in that sort of preservation side of our mission, right? That bifurcated mission. Jenny Wolf is a certified planner. She's a cultural resource advocate. She earned her master's degree from the University of Florida, specializing in historic preservation and spending over 15 years in local government and nonprofit preservation planning. During her 10 years as historic preservation officer for the city of St. Augustine, she managed the Historic Preservation Division. She works as a preservation planning specialist currently for Preservation Design Partnership, a nationally recognized firm for architectural preservation planning and flood mitigation design based in Philadelphia. Since 2014, she's been on the board of the trustees of the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation and was recently completed her term as the president of that board. When Hurricane Matthew happened in 2016, Jenny and I knew each other. She called me. She was like, Marty, I've not been through this. I know you have been through this. So she said, can you help? And I convinced the dean and our attorneys for the University of Florida. We suspended classes and I took the historic preservation students over and we worked with Jenny for a week and we assessed something like 500 or 600 properties. And that set Jenny and I, who already, I think we're friends and liked each other, on this kind of resiliency path together. So thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you, Marty. Well, I do want to again repeat the previous speakers' gratitude for y'all coming this morning to listen to us as we try to share some of our experiences. And I appreciate Marty for reaching out and letting me share with you some of what I know, which is getting to the on-the-ground level, working with a local government, working with a statewide nonprofit, having to go and learn these things just as they happen. And as someone who was personally affected by flooding, I've had to learn that, you know, well, what does resilience mean to me? And what can we learn from it as we, in particular, take a look as what that can look like in the future? So my goal here is to share with you some of the language that you might be hearing about, some of the guidance that you might be hearing from FEMA or your building officials going forward. These are things that I had to learn as a city official in responding to Hurricane Matthew, because in school and historic preservation at the time when I was going there, it's not like we learned about sea level rise. It's not like we learned about disaster management. We learned about how to keep buildings the same. And what I had come to the conclusion after experiencing Hurricane Matthew is that while preservation has always been recognized as managing change for the future, we're having to do that much more differently than what we were trained to be comfortable with. So this was my experience. Hurricane Matthew, my personal belongings out in the front. And as I've driven across your community here, I understand that that is a similar experience for some of you. So I can appreciate the recovery efforts and the processes that you have to be going through emotionally during this recovery process. So I sympathize. But what I do want, so speaking of Matthew, the upper right corner just shows you one of my smiling colleagues, how the water went basically almost over the top of her head for Hurricane Matthew. That was St. Augustine in 2015. So how can we adapt buildings? We've been looking at landscapes and we've been looking at communities,
And we're going to try to get down to that individual building scale now. And some of the examples that I'm going to show you are maybe code compliant. They might not be code compliant. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But part of the important thing is to figure out what are the options that are out there? What are the avenues that are informing your decisions? Because you may be making decisions based on insurance. You may be making decisions based on those building codes. But you may not have to deal with either, and you may want to voluntarily adapt your building. So there's some levels that you can look at so that you can be empowered to make the decisions that work for you, your home, or place of business, and your budget. So this is the graphic that I'm going to work through. We're going to start at the top. But as we go through, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about FEMA compliance activities and what that looks like. I presume that everyone here understands that your building codes will mandate certain means of adaptation. That could be bringing up the finished floor elevation to a certain level that the government, your local building official says is where it needs to be, or it may be because of your insurance company, or you may want to get a more discount so that you want to get that a little bit higher. But the other column on the end are those voluntary activities. So I'll show you some images of each of those as we go through. And the first is we're going to talk about wet floodproofing. And what that means is that you're letting the water come and go. And understanding that the materials and the objects that you have in your home or your building can be subject to flooding. So you want to consider where those are located. You also want to make sure that you're dealing with the water pressure as it comes in. You don't want to deal with interior building issues where it's growing so much pressure, hydrostatic pressure, that you can cause other damage unintentionally. So there are things called flood vents, which you see in the center photo. That is in Charleston, a newer building, but built within the context. And those flood vents are allowed to open and close and allow water come freely in and out. The building on the far left is actually a property owner who is making some voluntary decisions, but is FEMA compliant. Because what he's doing is taking his home and he is raising the finished floor level up above those concrete blocks. And that way he can get his lower insurance costs. He can keep, it's actually a historic building in downtown St. Augustine. So he can keep that, and he's going to reuse that space as garage area. And so he's changing the use from residential, which allows him to do that. And some of this comes down to, well, who's going to come in and do that survey and say where his livable, habitable floor space is? That does take working with your officials, and it may be that you need an engineer when you get what's called an elevation certificate to show what that's going to be. But he made some significant changes, but it's all from the interior of the building. I'll show you an exterior later. And then on the far right, one of the options is raising the interior floor by just filling it in. And that's a commercial building in downtown St. Augustine. It's lived many different lives, but as you can see from the ghosted paint sign, it used to be a feed store, actually. And then as tourism happened, I used to be a bicycle shop, and then it became a movie theater for a really long time, and now it's going to become, add to St. Augustine's collection of restaurants. But that is currently under construction downtown. Voluntary improvement activities. Again, I'll share with you, this is such a micro scale because this is actually a little apartment building on property that my husband and I currently own. And we are not in a flood zone. By the way, I'm in Pensacola, Florida. I was in St. Augustine for 10 years, but 2 years ago we moved to Pensacola, my husband's hometown. And on our property, there was a cute little garage apartment that had been converted a long time ago. And we had a rain incident come in, one of those things that dropped, I don't know what the recorded volume was, and it flooded this building up to about, I would say, 6 inches. And we decided that, well, what are we going to do? I saw what happened in St. Augustine. What are we going to do? We have to rip out the drywall. We have to build back better. And what does that look like for us? So we raised the electrical outlets. We also came back and put in hardy board. And you can see in the center photograph where the wall is projecting out, there's a gap between the hardy board and what's going to be the painted floorboard. And the floorboard we could have done in a plastic material, but instead we chose what I would call a cheaper throwaway wood material that we can easily pop off if it were to flood again, and allow air, once we get in some fans, to ventilate the area and get it dried out. Now it's all painted white and it looks kind of cute, but it looks different, and we did that ourselves. So one of my other messages is that there are a lot of things that you can do yourselves. And we're going to talk about property maintenance a little bit later, and Rosa Lowinger is going to get into more of those details, I believe. And then the other thing is just raising your equipment. So these are voluntary things. They're not going to get you insurance discounts or be code compliant, but that's what we decided to do. Next one is dry flood proofing. So what does that look like for FEMA compliance? First of all, that is not acceptable for building codes or FEMA for residential properties. And what that is putting a wetsuit around a building. They will not accept that. You may do that voluntarily on your own, but it is not going to do anything for your building code compliance or your insurance. Some of the things that that can start to look like is raising the lintels or the windowsills of your windows and filling them in where that looks appropriate and can work. And really, in terms of preservation language, it's not a bad thing. You can still see where that original sill was. It still reads, and it still is an opening. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, and we were doing some work for the Polish American Society in St. Petersburg, and their building got flooded, and over time you could actually see where they had filled in some of their windows in a very similar manner, but not from flooding. I think it was due to heat and just heating and cooling issues. There are also seals and things that you can put on your below grade materials if you have foundations that go down that far. Most of Florida doesn't have that kind of foundation system, but this is some of the work that Dominique Hawkins has done with Preservation Design Partnership, who I work for also, but this was before I came on board. But not all materials will accept a seal, and not every type of material should have a sealant on it. So there are other factors to consider. And then, of course, there are the panels that you can put at your doors and window openings if you have someone strong enough and willing and able to come in and install those ahead of a storm. At home, what that can look like is making sure that the simplest things, like the areas around any of your spigots, vents and things are properly sealed and filled. That's water spigots, door dams. This is for a garage door. This is actually the back of that garage of that house in St. Augustine that I showed you first, where he was converting that lower level space to garage. And not only did he do that, but then he's got his own garage door dams that are in place. So that's a manageable thing to do as a property owner. The other thing when you're thinking about building maintenance and painting the exterior of your buildings is what kind of paint to use. There's a church in St. Augustine that is recently being completely rehabilitated. And one of the scopes of work was to figure out how we can keep moisture out of the building. And it has an issue with rising damp. And so there's a slight color change that you can tell on those first 3 courses of block. It's much brighter white, and that is because it has a mineral silicate coating on it as opposed to a latex. which I understand it would have been better if we could have put that on the whole building. But at least that's at the ground level where they have water splashing up, water running through, and some rising damp, because that will still let the water expirate through that material while shedding water as it's coming down from rain. Some of the other things that folks have done in St. Augustine is they've banded together as a couple neighbors on St. George Street in the residential area and built a property wall. How many of you here have been to St. Augustine? Okay, a lot of you. So you know that property walls are a prominent part of the landscape because it's the Spanish colonial design that they put the wall across the front so they could keep all of their animals and activities enclosed and have that clearly defined private space. So they took some of that essence, even in areas that you don't have a building up on the street front, and built a wall, and they'll have door dams around those driveway openings that they can put in. And what you don't see is that there's walls on the outer. It does connect between the three buildings to the sides and the rear of their property. Again, this is something that FEMA is not going to consider code compliant, nor will building officials. It does not count towards meeting your flood mitigation requirements. Some of the big questions that we've been grappling with preservationists, I think, is building elevations. And this was something that causes a really strikingly different appearance in a building's streetscape. And because of Hurricane Matthew, that was one of the things, as the city official who was in charge of how are we going to adapt to this change in St. Augustine? How are we going to deal with property owners that are going to have a knee-jerk reaction to want to elevate their building a whole story, and so they can have garage parking underneath, or maybe 14 feet because they're going to get a better insurance discount. What are we going to do to deal with those? And I'll get into a moment later what Charleston has done, but in St. Augustine, we were doing one building at a time. So what that looks like on an individual level, if I were to say doing this compatibly, is raising it to the minimal level needed for your personal safety, but also what's called a design flood elevation. It may be what FEMA calls, or your building official calls, your base flood elevation, but a design flood elevation may add a foot or two of what's called freeboard. And in Florida, they adopted a 1 foot freeboard. So it's the FEMA +1, so to speak, and I'm not sure what Sarasota County is, their design flood elevation, but it could change. But the idea is that FEMA has one level, and then your local government can set up another level of protection. But what you'll notice, the before and after, they luckily were able to do some really great improvements, restore the opening of the front porch as well as the back porch. And also when they put in the screening, because of course for insurance purposes, you have to screen off your crawl space, they recessed the lattice behind those brick columns. And this was before it was completely done, but the brick piers that you see now have been painted sympathetically with the wood lattice work to kind of just blend in and fade away and not to pop out. But speaking of site features, that knee wall is still there. So it also still shows you, how the building used to relate to the street. It can also be done with mid-century era. I don't want to say mid-century modern to this audience because that's not what this is, but it is a post-war housing area in Davis Shores. So if you're downtown St. Augustine and you go to cross the Bridge of Lions, there's a neighborhood called Davis Shores. And these are mostly homes that were built on grade. Some of them are slab on grade, where you have a concrete flooring and your wall studs right on top of that. Some are a stem wall, so you can see that there are some holes on that second course of concrete block. So we know that's a stem wall construction. The wall continues all around, but it still allows air ventilation underneath there, as well as water passage. So that one was elevated, and you can see where it used to be by looking at the garage. That used to be the grade level where that was. What really triggered some of our deep conversations is that area right along what's called the bayfront. And we have a new seawall there. I say we, I don't live there anymore, but I was very, very well connected emotionally and physically with the city. So it's hard to lose that sense of belonging and ownership with what they're experiencing. But the seawall would have been right across the street from this. And what you have are two buildings side by side, and then there were a couple houses, so that's why there's the break in the image. But there are three houses on that street that were elevated. And we were looking at, well, what about this popsicle effect? How do we tell one property owner they can go up to 14 feet, but the other one, is only at 12 feet above sea level? And fortunately, the Historic Review Board was able to work with the property owners and come to a compromise because the one that's in the middle was the one that wanted to go up higher. And they did go up a little bit more, but it's still in general context. But what you start to see, well, first of all, you can still see, again, where those walls are and where the original relationship is from the sidewalk to the front entrance. And that is an important thing. They weren't necessarily going to keep those. And I encourage them to leave the gates, put a door dam behind it, but leave the gate in front, even if it's not being used. It's just those little things that help to make that connection. And the property owners chose to elevate differently. You see a lot of different infrastructure that has to come in and be more prominent, like the stairs. And there's another property where you can see that even more significantly. This is not in the downtown area of St. Augustine, but there are different ways of dealing with that. And that's something that we have to, again, accept as part of this change, is where is that going to be? But it also might be determined by your building setbacks, because the higher you go, if you have a compact property, you might need to keep those stairs out front to meet, get up to the grade of your entry space. So you might have to have a couple trips to your building officials to make that happen for variances. Believe it or not, this is another one in Davis Shores that was elevated. You can see the big semi-looking door is because on the right, because they have an RV. And so they wanted, while they're at it, let's go ahead and build a garage that can fit our recreational vehicle and store everything we ever wanted down there. But that was an alternative to demolition. And Davis Shores, this particular neighborhood, is not designated. It was planned in 1926 by a developer during the Florida boom era, but never got fully developed until after the post-war. And that's why we saw so many buildings that were ranch style and at grade. And we certainly didn't want to lose all of them, and we have no purview as long as they weren't demolishing them. Our local board had no purview over how they decided to mitigate. So we just take this as an example for what it was. Building relocation is very similar in the sense of you have to think about where it's going to go, what that flood zone is going to be, and if there is one, and also deal with your utilities. This is what looks like a very unloved building in that same neighborhood of Davis Shores. It's almost forgotten. It has a story to it. The family was very important to the turpentining industry in the whole county, if not the North Florida region. And the last matriarch of the family had gotten ill, and she was older, and she had to move out of the home. And so it had been vacant for some time when Hurricane Matthew came up, and we had a request to demolish the property. And on the inside, it was this treasure trove of articles, materials, documentation I can't remember what the calendar on the wall dated to, but you can see the telephone. It was like her office was right there for running the still operating, not turpentine anymore, but the wood agricultural tree farm that they were running across Northeast Florida. And it was just really special. And add to that, Pecky cypress, board and batten, walls on the inside, and the floors were meticulously aligned. I crawled in the attic, heart pine rafters, beautiful, smelled like heart pine, something that should not be demolished. And fortunately, the city entered into negotiation to purchase the property for an agreeable sum, and then decided to put the house up for sale. And because of all this heritage and history of the building, we were looking for someone that could be a good caretaker. And that fell into the hands of the Florida Agricultural Museum, which makes sense because they showcase a lot of the turpentine industry in St. Johns County and Northeast Florida. So thankfully, they won the bid to take the building off the property. And I thought I had a picture of it now, but the property now, the reason why the city wanted it is to improve stormwater for the neighborhood. There's a creek running behind it. They needed more space to build a berm, to build a space for water to flow through, and to significantly avoid more nuisance flooding in that neighborhood. A prettier example of relocation is the Cape San Blas Lighthouse and Keeper's Quarters. This is now in Port St. Joe. Believe it or not, these buildings and that lighthouse have been moved three times. This is the third home. But their view is from the top of the lighthouse is still close to water. So one of the things that I was mentioning before, you still need to consider where your utilities are going to be going and plan for having some flooding impacts or wind impacts. And speaking of wind, there are alternatives that FEMA puts out there that allows you to get, mostly it's for insurance discounts. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that if you have certain types of shutters, if you have spray foam insulation, which is so not the best alternative for some historic buildings, but some people do use it, and it might be right in other places. It also takes a lot of material and structural change in the building so that you can carry the loads from potential wind uplift down to the foundation. So what you see are hurricane straps or other various types of ties from your roof rafters to your wall structure all the way down to the foundation. So there are certain levels of wind mitigation that will be severely impactful to your property, but something that if you're already undergoing a rehabilitation or recovering from a flood incident where you have to remove some of the exterior wall areas, these are things that you might want to consider as add-ons. And again, it may get you some wind insurance discounts, but it's worth asking your contractor or your architect to say, well, how much, would that add? Could I do that? The center photo is, I was surprised to find this very common in Charleston. They have exterior window panels that they put up. So that is and obviously they have operable shutters. Operable shutters, especially when they're original, are a fantastic thing. They're already right there on site and you don't have to store them. Just use them and make them workable. But then having that exterior panel also helps with your thermal and your heating and cooling bills. But as Rosa may allude to, is that's something else that you have to watch out for, because if not done right, you can cause yourself more maintenance problems. You can get condensation from temperature changes that's going to cause some deterioration. But basically, as I mentioned earlier, maintenance is the biggest thing. Unfortunately, after Hurricane Ian, There was a lot of impacts in Fort Myers and Fort Myers Beach. This is in a little historic district that's in Fort Myers. They mostly had wind impacts. Their roof didn't look too bad before. And afterwards, it still wasn't too bad. They didn't have to replace the entire roof. But these are part of the things that, you see a lot. Even as I was flying in, you see the blue tarps. That's one of the biggest signs that you've had a storm impact. Unlike flooding, their house, I believe, flooded as well, but you wouldn't have known it. Unless I zoomed out of the picture on the right that has the pods panel or the pods storage unit on site where they had to move their belongings into, you wouldn't have known they flooded. Once all the debris piles are removed, you may not know that it flooded in this area, and some people forget that areas in Florida are still recovering from flooding incidents from 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so we have to keep that out there in the media. And that is one of the things that we try to do with the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, is make sure that our public officials at the state government levels are aware of the needs of our community members. So that is something that we actively do to reach out and to listen to where those issues are, and to provide some training opportunities as well, and just some more documentation where we can, as Marty mentioned. I really loved one of the things that came out of one of our projects was learning that trees can be like straws, where they can absorb water on site. And there's documentation of just how much water. So when you're looking at site improvements at the smaller scale, the individual property scale, not only could you build some retaining walls and put in a French drain, but again, consider some of those landscape options. And it may be a berm, but what are the plant materials that can be salt tolerant, that they can help absorb more water, and that can help shade your home? And these are things that there are materials out there. And I have some up here for you that I'll pass around as I start to talk about what are other communities doing. And I wanted to say this when I started my talk, is that I'm representing several hats. This is just me, Jenny Wolf, but I work for Preservation Design Partnership. I'm on the board of the Florida Trust. I worked for a city who experienced damage. So when I route these around, this is in no way any kind of promotional material. It's just a small, medium, and large type of level of documents that you can think about some of the things or some of the tools that can help you start having these conversations in your community. So one is flood mitigation design guidance for historic residences. This was done for the city of St. Augustine while I was still there by Preservation Design Partnership. One is resilience guidance for Charleston. And the really neat thing about this is that in the title, you see nothing about historic buildings. In this document, it talks about equity. It talks about let's all think about our buildings, our homes, in the same way that we would a historic building. And let's not block it in time. Let's think about how we can help our entire community survive and recover. That's something that, for me personally, I feel that helped aid my transition in looking at how we are allowing buildings to adapt and be elevated and change so significantly, is thinking about the fact that we're preserving communities. So that there are a lot of tools in here that talks about all the scales from site, from windows to doors to roofs. And this document I can only show you, and it can't leave this room because it's not published, but it is storm guidance for Florida's historic properties. That was a state of Florida grant from the National Park Service that came out of Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria hazard mitigation grant funding. And this is a similar but thicker work product that goes through all of the scales of adaptation from individual buildings to communities. And one of the things that's really neat about, I'll show you one of these images from the St. Augustine Guide is the idea of elevating your property to different levels. What could that look like, and what do you need to think about? And it has guidance for how many stairs are you going to need? Just some of that basic information. So I'll pass these around, but I'm basically just going to summarize some of the work that I have already introduced. I'll start one back here, and I'll start this one over here. So these are some of the various areas that Preservation Design Partnership has been exposed to. Me, as I've been working with them, most of my experience with resiliency has been in Florida, but the material that you're seeing is from years of work and understanding by Dominique Hawkins of what it means to translate FEMA requirements to individual property owners. And part of that process was just trying to understand, where does historic preservation fit into resiliency? It's also part of the conversation of trying to see where there are challenges across the state of Florida, and speaking between building officials, floodplain managers, city managers, council officials, property owners, Main Street directors, anyone who is a stakeholder in the community that wants to be a voice in how we determine we're going to adapt for our community, getting them in a room and saying, well, what does that look like to you? And what are the barriers that you have to think about? So many communities are dealing with different ways of measuring height. I know it seems very mundane, but you could measure height from the center of your street, the grade of your building, or the sidewalk, and that's different in every community, but that's going to inform what your building code requirement is going to tell you how high you have to elevate your house to, or raise your finished floor to, whatever that is going to be. So in Charleston, the example that is being passed around starts to talk about all threats. And believe it or not, they are also subject to earthquakes. And so we looked at earthquakes, flooding, heat, and wind events. And we looked at buildings all across the community without regard to thinking about those high-style, lovely buildings that we know of along the waterfront, because those property owners probably have a team of professionals that are advising them. We wanted to be able to provide some materials to the average folks that live on the upper parts of the peninsula and off the peninsula. So that's what that project is able to afford them. But it takes a lot of community input and community participation. And the best thing, I guess the advice that I want to leave you with is to get estimates from different contractors, start to learn the vocabulary. Don't be afraid to ask questions of your local officials if you're not understanding some of the terms that they're using. Organize, work with other neighborhood groups to make sure that you're using all of your energies most efficiently, because there are FEMA resources, there are grant programs out there, and there's a lot of barriers to getting one of those accomplished. And if you can work together, you can cut through some of that red tape a little bit more quickly. So again, I just want to thank you all for this opportunity to be here. And I put, my email is jennywolf@planningtopreserve.com. I thought I had it on there, I apologize. But that is the way to reach me there if there's anything. The Florida Trust is working closely with Marty as well to make sure that we can do anything. We certainly will. And in fact, there is a webinar November 26th from 12 to 1 that we are going to be talking across several topics and having a Q&A opportunity for anyone to ask questions on our panel. Some of those will be architects, some of those will be planners like myself, but we're going to try to get some information out there for some of the communities to help them navigate paths forward. And my heart is with you all, and I wish you the best. You have beautiful resources here, and I'm just thankful that y'all are being so forward-thinking. So thanks to you, Marty.
Thank you.
Okay, last but not least, and I'm not going to read her extensive bio because I've asked her to introduce a little bit about herself, but I will say that Rosa Lowinger, thank you for joining us. She is a materials conservator and she specializes in sculptures, monuments, integral architectural artworks, and contemporary art. And I would venture to say is one of the leading architectural conservators in the United States. So join me in welcoming Rosa.
Yeah, I got that.
So I'm coming up here because I have to use my notes. I'm going to preach to you from here. So I have a clicker too. I might try to use it, but if it doesn't work, then I'll let you guys know and you'll help me, right? Good morning. And again, same as my other colleagues, thank you to Marty for inviting me here. Thank you to the board, to Anne. It's a pleasure to be back in Sarasota. I've been here many times. I was at that 2013 Docomomo conference and was at those Sanderling cabanas, and it was an amazing place to be. And I'm so sorry for the loss of that location, and so happy to be here to do what I can to give you some bits of advice that is very much in the weeds about preserving historic buildings. Did it work? No. Yes. Okay, so Marty asked me to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about what I do, because there's a pretty good chance that most people in this room will never have worked with a conservator. Materials conservators, which is what I am, we're trained professionals who manage repair and long-term care of specific materials, historic sites, buildings, works of art, decorative features, architectural elements. The images on the screen were taken of me throughout my career. You see a very young me in many different places, dealing with the Watts Towers in Los Angeles, copper corrosion at the University of Hawaii, working on a 1950s mosaic that was pulled off a building rather unceremoniously in Miami Beach recently and is going to be put back. Our work is about the lifespan of things, and our work is based on science and material knowledge, and the aim is to prolong the lifespan of heritage through careful consideration of what works best in a particular situation before it is implemented. Just briefly, because Marty asked me to introduce myself, since the mid-2000s, I've been writing a great deal about conservation and preservation for general audiences. Since our field is not really that well known outside of intimate circles and the museum world, I've written about it and the impact of preservation and conservation in many places, in particular Havana, Cuba, the place where I was born, and I grew up in Florida. I grew up in Miami, like so many Cuban Americans, and have been living in the Northeast, was living in the Northeast, and now I currently divide my time between Los Angeles, oh wait, I went the wrong way. I got the hang of this now. Between Los Angeles and Miami, and I founded a firm there in 2008, one of several firms that I had founded in the past, called RLA Conservation LLC, which is a materials conservation firm that deals specifically with metals, with masonry, with wood, with terracotta, all the materials of monuments and historic buildings, and I work with a network of conservators around the United States. Because my firm is based in Los Angeles and Miami, we are very intimate with disasters, and we've been doing it for many years and are frequently called into triage on situations that are unexpected. What you learn after doing this for many years is that this is an ongoing situation. This is not unusual, and yes, the water events are getting more profound and the fire events are getting more profound, but they're becoming global in places that you don't really expect them. And what we do as part of our work is try to sort of fine-tune best practices, ways to create solutions that are going to be sustainable over time. And what I mean by sustainable is that you're not going to have to do them and redo them and redo them over and over, where you're going to get a modicum of longevity. So for example, one very small example that is not necessarily relevant to to the specific thing you're dealing with, but I show here, is on the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you see this petrochrome mural in the city of Los Angeles that was relocated not because of climate damage, but because of extraordinary and intense vandalism that was occurring to it, because it was a site-specific WPA mural that was built for a particular corridor that stopped being used once the LA freeways were being built and the piece was getting ravaged. So its relocation was intended to prevent the need for ongoing care in much the same way as moving a building would be. And similarly, where you see on the bottom right corner someone repainting an outdoor sculpture, repainting outdoor sculptures, monuments and outdoor sculptures are something that occur in many communities that are part of urban renovation, that are part of 1% laws for historic properties and for landscaping. Those pieces are intended to be repainted. Repainting is not part of damage, it's an intentional part of what happens to those pieces, but you try to use materials that are going to prolong the amount of time that you go between repaintings, which then makes it more sustainable. Other things that conservators do, and how we make our work possible, is we engage in a great deal of testing, often for specific projects like this building that some of you may know, the Miami Marine Stadium, which was slated for demolition after Hurricane Andrew, a Class 5 hurricane that devastated South Florida in 1994. And the city of Miami used the hurricane as an excuse to try to knock down a building that it didn't want to maintain to begin with. And its program, by the way, this building is in pretty darn good condition, all things considered, given that the powers that be in Miami have wanted it to fall apart by neglect, but it hasn't happened because it was a resilient building built well. But what happens is, from projects like this, we learn broader lessons that are applicable on a smaller scale to homeowners. Similarly, at Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, which some of you may know here, Miami's answer to the Ringling Museum, if you will, not quite as grand, but it's it was built between 1914 and 1922 and is the home of, was the home of businessman James Deering of the International Harvester fortune. And it's a waterfront locale, a National Register site with a great deal of interior and exterior decorative details. And the thing about a place like this is that its demolition is not on the table, even though its site is as vulnerable as anything you could possibly imagine. But no one's considering moving this building, raising this building, demolishing this building. We got to deal with it as it is. And so my profession tries to manage those kinds of questions. But in most cases of damage, we have to determine what's possible and what's not possible. What can be salvaged and what can be scrapped. I show you here a fragment of murals, a fragment of a mural at Holy Trinity Cathedral, a church in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, that collapsed during the 2010 earthquake that devastated that Caribbean capital. Prior to the earthquake, this 1920s cathedral was once one of the country's most important art venues, let alone a house of worship. It was in the 1950s, it was decorated with murals by the country's most important artists, murals which were done using vernacular Haitian scenes to illustrate the life of Christ. There were 14 of these murals altogether. They were all painted directly onto a thin concrete render on the limestone walls without any reinforcements, because that's how that building had been built, since earthquakes really don't happen that often in that area. They hadn't seen seismic activity in a very long time. And this here is the building after the earthquake. The entire nave of the church collapsed, taking with it 11 of the 14 murals. here is how those remaining 11 murals looked. Our firm worked with something called the Smithsonian Haiti Cultural Recovery Program to rescue the 3 that were left in place. And the question was, what do we do about these fragments? Do we try to rescue the 11 extremely important murals that wound up looking like rubble? Now, the question isn't could they be rescued? The question is, should they be rescued? Because they could be. Even though this looks impossible, in 1997, when there was an earthquake in Italy that almost destroyed the church, the Cathedral of St. Francis in Assisi, the Giotto murals in that building wound up in large part looking like this, but there was no question that that World Heritage Site was going to be restored. So the process of what we do as conservators is we define what is possible, but the decision of is it doable is often someone else's responsibility. Similarly, you asked the same question of Notre Dame Cathedral. This is a project that took tens and tens of thousands of hours, a budget that would, fix all of Sarasota, and there was no question that it was going to be done. So these are things that are parsed out individually by what is allowable. Deciding what is possible, what is worth saving and conserving, whether it is a stairwell at Vizcaya after the hurricane season of 2005, or those murals in Port-au-Prince, or houses in Biloxi, Mississippi after Katrina, those are based on those variables that I was talking about. And I am not here to talk about what should or should not be done, because that is not the conservator's job. The conservator's job is only to tell you what is possible from a material standpoint, and also to try to get things done right the first time so that you don't create problems, as Jenny was saying, by using improper methodologies. Conservation, just to finish with the intro to this profession, has been a technically driven practice since about the 1700s, but the modern field of conservation does not come into existence until 1966, when the raging waters of the Arno River flooded the city of Florence. That was a seminal watershed event, no pun intended, in our profession, because the specialties of our field, whether they were people who worked on works on paper or textiles or stone or paintings, were working in individual studios, but everybody came together in Florence, and the lessons of Florence really informed the profession moving forward. So a disaster event like what you guys have gone through here and what communities around the world go through all the time advance our understanding of what's possible from a material standpoint, much the same way that medicine advances after calamities of this sort and wars, unfortunately. Now, no one would have suggested that Florence be abandoned. That just was simply not a possibility. And similarly, we learn what works and what doesn't over time because of things like this. We improve our technical acuity and know that there are certain places that we're not going to abandon, like Venice, Italy, which is in as much danger as any place and has been undergoing this alta aqua situation for over half a century. And it is from this baseline that I came to Sarasota to see what was going on and what was possible. But before going there, I just want to show you a couple, before getting right down to what's going on here right now, I want to just show you 2 more images that illustrate this. Sometimes there is a reason to abandon a site. This is a striking example of this. This is a work of art, of land art in Italy, in Sicily. It's called Il Creto di Ghibellina by the Italian artist Alberto Burri. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this piece, but this is a concrete work of art that marks the location where a town was leveled by an earthquake in the 1960s, and the entire town just got up and moved 20 miles away to a place that was less vulnerable to the earth shaking. And the artist created this work to commemorate the location of the town, which is now, the artwork is now itself a World Heritage Site. So sometimes that decision is made. And that decision is made by residents and by other stakeholders who feel enough's enough, and we're not going to try to keep saving a place. But for the most part, most of the places on our planet, most of the cities and towns that we live in, Tokyo, Los Angeles, the entire Italian peninsula, is in some sort of vulnerability to natural disaster. And what we've learned recently with the flooding in Asheville, North Carolina, that took place, and wildfires that struck New York City a week ago. I don't know if you guys read about this, but there were wildfires in New York City a week ago, that we never know exactly where these things are going to happen and how they're going to happen. And if anything, it's going to continue to baffle us. So the response that our profession takes is to try to meet the challenge at a material level to complement the types of landscape resiliency and individual neighborhood resiliency that my colleagues spoke about this morning. This is my hometown of Havana, Cuba, recently. And this is a beautiful photo of the sky that I just like to show because, oh, it didn't. Thank you very much. My hometown, Havana, Cuba, and Vizcaya. And now to Sarasota. Let's talk about you guys. These are images that I took on Thursday when Marty took me around to look, and me and Jenny around to look at some of the damaged properties here on Siesta Key. And I'll be honest with you, given what I'd been reading about in the news media, I was supposed to be here for a different symposium before the hurricanes. And when Marty invited me to come here to be part of this panel presentation, and I was hearing what my other colleagues were going to present, I honestly said to him, what have I got to contribute to this dialogue? Because given what I'd read about in the media and how the media represented what had gone on here, I honestly expected to see the entire island leveled. I expected to see nothing standing, buildings so damaged beyond repair that there was nothing to be done. But it turns out that the question for me, what can a materials conservator contribute to this conversation about adaptation and design? Turns out that there is something. Because what I saw on that tour, what I saw in some of the houses that you all have allowed me to visit, was that the buildings that were built by the architects of the Sarasota School already came with a lot of great resilience built into them, even though they couldn't anticipate something as monstrous as these two back-to-back storms hitting the area. Please do not take these as glib observations. I don't intend to say that a cleanup of the sort that you've been going through is not overwhelming and exhausting. I don't want to minimize the cost of those repairs either. But if we're talking about heritage buildings, heritage neighborhoods, the Sarasota School that defines not just this region, but really informs, is as important in its own way for World Heritage as the city of Venice. What we have is something that was designed appropriately for its location, and from a material standpoint is manageable. So I want to just present a couple of ideas regarding what we can think about. What I want to offer by way of assistance is the basics of how we deal with impact of these events and how we prepare for them. I do a lot of lectures on disaster management and preparation, and one of the things I usually talk about is the difference between events that come without warning, like earthquakes or flash floods, or wildfires have a tiny window of warning, but not much, and hurricanes where they're going to come between June and November, and you usually have about a week's notice, although sometimes lately we don't have a week's notice, but you're aware. These are some of the things you can do. First, understand that what you usually have is probably better than and please pardon me if there are contractors in the room. I don't mean to speak ill of all contractors, but sometimes this rush to replace is not usually a good idea, is not always a good idea, because the materials that were designed originally are often better than what is being used to replace them. Second thing is, and I'm going to show you some examples, a lot of the damage is caused by deferred maintenance rather than a sudden event. This, by the way, was the story of the Miami Marine Stadium. If you want to read any of the publications about it, the hurricane, as it was a class 5 hurricane, did almost nothing to the structure, but deferred maintenance had been doing quite a bit. You can't underestimate good planning. And that there are a lot of truths and falsehoods out there about mold, about coatings, about sealants, and about what salts do. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of basic information around some of that. I'm not going to be able to do an entire lecture today on the resilience of concrete, terrazzo, Ocala block, wood, and metals, and how you deal with them. But I was really happy to see how much of these materials did a good job, especially the terrazzo. I was just utterly surprised by how well some of the terrazzo pavements did and how many of them did. There are exceptions, of course. And this isn't to say that cleaning up, 4 feet of sand and salt and mud is not in itself a daunting thing. But for the most part, these are materials that you can keep and you can fix and keep going with. That is not true of all materials. Not everything survives equally. For example, one of the things I think is always going to be difficult are experimental plastics, like that membrane on the roof of the cocoon house, a partially synthetic material, which is a category of materials that are human-made, meaning that they don't derive from nature in any way. And these are like hallmarks of the post-World War II period that you find everywhere. We live in an age of plastics. Plastics are everywhere and they impact us in all kinds of different ways. At the time, now they are getting better. Certainly most paint systems are a form of plastic, but at the time in the 1940s and 50s when architects and artists first started experimenting with these materials, they really were just so gaga excited about the possibilities of tweaking the plasticizers and the coatings and the the catalyzers, that they really made some mistakes. And I show you a work of art here, which is rather well known. It's part of a multiple called The Soft Screw by the contemporary artist Claes Oldenburg. You see it kind of melting there. This is what happens to this piece everywhere that it was made, even when it's kept in cold storage, as this one was in a museum, because all I'm trying to say to you is, this is a long-winded way of saying, your natural materials do a lot better than your synthetics. And this is why, in our profession, we are really skeptical of products that make amazing claims. To be permanent or impermeable or miraculous or a permanent sealant or complete, when people say sealing out water entirely, just doesn't happen. For many of these materials, we don't know what's in them. The formulas will change even within a product that has the same name. Many contain silicone, which is a material that can be very good in certain instances, but also makes retreatment with anything else practically impossible over time. Or they contain, contain an organosilane, which is a material that's kind of like liquid glass. You put it on a surface and then it coats it. So that's where you get these kinds of coatings that people say they're a permanent, impermeable material. You can't really believe that sort of thing. And the problem is that the product literature for these materials that makes these claims is really written by advertising people. You can read even their material safety data sheet and you're not going to get all the information. So for your historic properties, you really want to be wary of some of these because they can cause more problems. Here's a perfect example. Crazy glue, not good. Because crazy glue can do a great thing, which is like pop things together, but if you mismatch even slightly And you have no margin of error to pull it apart and put it back together. So all those glues that just like pop together and can't be taken apart, you never want to do something like that. So the one thing I really hope you get out of this today, what I'm trying to say is that that you watch for the materials that you use on things. The conditions also that I'm showing you here on the screen are not the product of storms. These are products of deferred maintenance. Corrosion of steel, the disaggregation of Ocala block. These are situations that develop over time. Yes, you can have it develop fast all of a sudden, but for the most part, when you start seeing these kinds of effects happening, they're really things that are developing over the long term. And the other thing too is, for example, on the Ocala block, putting on coatings that are as Jenny was saying, the idea of using a vapor permeable coating rather than one that seals it off is you're always going to be better off with something like that because the water is going to make its way behind it. Water is amazing, as you all know, it gets there. And then it starts to pull the surface off with the paint that's on top. So I want to just talk a little bit about some of the key issues that people deal with materials and how you can make slight improvements that will really prevent damage in the future and that will protect, as Jenny was showing, where you protect, I was really, I love that about protecting the area around a spigot. So as an area that keeps your building from being vulnerable. One of the first and most important things is to consider what needs to happen with steel, whether it's structural or within your concrete structure. This is one of the most widespread materials that is used in construction. And it is a great material for many reasons because it's very malleable. It has a lot of tensile strength. It helps strengthen things dramatically. You can obviously always detect whether you have steel by whether it responds to magnets because it's always magnetic. Stainless steel tends not to be magnetic, but can also be a little bit magnetic. It's very reactive, as you know. It will readily convert to iron oxide when there's water, oxygen, and chloride ions. And your best bet to mitigate it is to coat it properly. When you have it inside of concrete, what it does, the problem with it in concrete is if you have a small crack in the concrete and water starts to get in there, it starts to rust it. And since rust takes up more space than metallic steel, it starts to crack and then it lets more water in and it becomes this vicious cycle. So that you are always best off the minute you start to see a small crack, with even the tiniest bit of rust, address it right away. And even though I am deeply skeptical of so many materials that come on the market, this is a really good tried and true method that has been tested for many years now and works, that when you want to protect steel, you do it with a 3-part industrial paint system that is known as a 3-part paint stack. This is the kind of thing that they use to coat bridges. And what happens is you have a first primer that has zinc in it, and that is designed to complex with the steel because zinc keeps, it transforms the free iron radicals and so keeps it from rusting. The second primer is an epoxy, and epoxies are really good for one thing in particular, for keeping moisture out, as long as you have it all over the place. The thing that epoxies are not good is to be exposed to UV. So when you have a zinc primer and an epoxy primer, unless you're embedding that steel into concrete, you then want to make sure you have another coating on top to protect the epoxy layer. And if you put, on your steel beams or steel columns or anything that's exposed, if that's prepared properly, That's the other thing. You got to make sure you use, you follow the manufacturer's instructions on how to apply it. When, what the time, you have to have certain times between the first primer and the second primer, or you have to sand them. And you follow those instructions, that steel's going to do well. That one I put my hand to the fire for. Another thing I want to talk about briefly here, because people deal with this a lot, is salt. Obviously, when you have a big storm surge like you've had, salt gets into a lot of things, but salt is there anyway. If you live by the coast, if you live within a mile of the coast, there is salt in all your porous surfaces anyway. Yeah. The water vapor brings it, the wind brings it. The rain washes some of it away, but some of it still does leach into your materials. And how salt damages is really cool. I learned this right at the beginning of my graduate training. It's so damaging because it does it two ways. It does it physically, because every time it liquefies and crystallizes, it does so in a different shape, and it starts to attack the pore structure. But it also does it chemically, because salts, the type of sodium chloride, which is basically ocean salt or table salt, when it's exposed to water, it also becomes slightly acidic. And materials like Ocala block that have limestone in it, the salt will affect the limestone. It doesn't necessarily affect the Portland cement matrix, but it will affect the limestone. So the thing about limestone, the thing about salts though, is these soluble salts are very easy to remove. You literally remove them with clear water, distilled water, water that doesn't have salts in it. And you can do it with paper poultices, with clay poultices, with rinsing in between. Once the salt gets deep into a matrix and you start to see all that crumbling, you literally have to poultice it off, because if you just try to rinse, you're going to also rinse your actual stone or your concrete off the surface as well. But it's one of those problems that is there, so it's there all the time. If you live in one of our coastal regions, it's always going to be there. So it's not something to panic about. It's just something to address over time. And the other thing, and this really doesn't have a lot to do with the storm, because I noticed that for the most part, the terrazzo floors I saw, and I obviously didn't see all of them, I saw a few, did very well. But terrazzo it's an incredibly resilient material. In my memoir that I showed you before, I kind of liken terrazzo to marriages. They're very resilient materials, but when they start to go, they can fall apart very easily. And when they're repaired poorly, they create bigger problems. But and the thing is that most people who are contractors are going to tell you that you can't repair this kind of damage, that you can only replace it, and that isn't true. It is a complex process because it's artisanal. You can't really buy a kit and do it. It has to be sort of unpacked and thought through. But once it's thought through, it's a fairly easy process to do it. A lot of this work that I'm talking about for these types of beautiful historic materials, a lot of the work is in the preparation, in the getting it right to begin with. And then later on, the implementation happens pretty quickly. And just to show you that it can really be done, this is a repair that our firm did for an outdoor terrazzo map in the city of Kansas City, and you can see the before and after there on the lower right-hand corner. Marty, how much time do I have? Okay, so I have a lot more slides, but I'm not going to obviously be able to show them to you. But I just wanted to give you a couple final thoughts. How do you plan? Know what to expect, prepare by maintenance, understand materials, and make an emergency plan. And what I believe what I think of as the way to go about this is to do a lot of documentation before the event. People talk about documentation after the event. Anybody who lives in a vulnerable location should have very good documentation of their building and its contents. I like to do, I'm not like a super technically sophisticated person, but I like to do photographic documentation, video documentation, and then information that you write in prose. You talk it into a phone if you want, and you want to write down your salvage priorities, because when you have 3 or 4 days to prepare before a storm and you have all your family's heirlooms, you have all your family photographs, your textiles, your wooden things, you want to really have a plan for how you're going to approach the movement of those things. And well, I have a lot more slides that I'm not going to show because we can do this at some other point, but I did want to show one more thing. Here we go, wait. Don't be panicked by mold. We're sitting in a room that's full of mold right now. Mold's in the air. Whenever you live if you live anywhere where the humidity is above 50%, there's mold in the air. And it's in the walls and it's under the house. And yes, when you have thick, ugly accumulations of it, it can be toxic to people who have respiratory vulnerabilities and other autoimmune deficiencies. But for the most part, mold is cleaned off pretty easily. And you can do it with like light solutions dilute solutions of bleach. But you don't want to put those materials onto your vulnerable works of art and artifacts. So like if you have costumes or textiles or family photographs, you don't want to put bleach on them. And then one last word before we're done. I just want to say one last word. When you are going to salvage things that are wet, you don't want to dry them too quickly. You want to blot rather than wipe. And if you have photographs or anything that is stuck together, don't try to pull them apart yourself. Freeze them and call a professional. And is that okay? Is that enough? Good? All right, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for telling us. I already knew about it. I don't know if anyone else did, about the soft landscaping versus hard landscaping. It works so much better. I don't know if you've been down to the Bayfront area, if Marty took you down to the Bayfront Park. The city of Sarasota did a little experiment, the 3 different types of edges, and they, surprise, surprise, found out that the soft one works the best. And more recently with our Van Wezel Performance Hall, they admitted that the big hard seawall, 8-foot hard seawall, is not working, and perhaps they might do some mangroves there or something. So that's fine, but now what do we do? You know, ever since 1920, we've been making these hard walls, and if you just drive around here with all the canal properties, how do we incentivize people to get rid of those seawalls? You know, I mean, this is the United States, and people don't want to be told what to do with their property. And then also connected with that, from my understanding, let's say there's a street of 20 and only 3 of them do that, they make the soft property, and then when there's a flood, all the water comes into those people and they almost get like penalized for doing the right thing. So that's my question.
Yeah, that last bit is one of the hardest pieces because, and you see this everywhere in cities, when we're doing work in downtown Boston, it's not only private property owners, but it's also the city, the state, one agency, the other agency. They haven't all been talking together, right? And it becomes this kind of like, oh my God, what are we going to do? The first part of that, when you deal with larger scale city projects, is to really think about how to rethink government. And frankly, City of Boston, City of Seattle, City of New York have started to do this. Government departments are set up to deal with transportation or parks or housing, but traditionally there haven't been conversations between and among those agencies. That's what these new city roles are doing, and that's what new structures in government are doing, is figuring out water's going to go everywhere, so you need somebody coordinating all those city departments. So there's something that can happen at a governmental level. But then there has to be something done at the private property owner level too. Again, the city of Austin, the city was able to do so much, but they couldn't tell a private property owner, you have to do this. And so what they were able to do through some of the planning is to say, okay, if you want that flood protection to be in our jurisdiction, here's where it would go and here's what it would look like. But that may leave certain properties more vulnerable because that flood protection would be behind them. You could think about flood protection in different ways, but they started to incentivize those private property owners to become part of the conversation and, frankly, to be able to contribute funding to that. There was one group of property owners along the downtown waterfront that did get together. They decided to hire some consultants, and they developed a plan that was really the first of its kind in the Northeast, where these individual property owners realized that they had to do something collectively. And so they put the money behind it and began to go forward. And now we're working at the other side of that, saying, okay, how do we take some of those good ideas working for the city and integrate it with some of the public strategies that we're doing? So it takes time, it takes a lot of conversation, it takes a lot of back and forth. But it is possible. For the first part of your question, you said something about, these walls have been built. It's where we bring in not only technical experts, but economic development experts. Putting a house or putting a property next to an ugly wall does nothing for you, right? But economic development experts can tell you how an investment in landscape, whether it's doing flood protection or not, can actually increase your property value, right? And so by making those kinds of investments, there are ways that private property owners can benefit economically, but of course they can also benefit from the just health and well-being and resilient aspects of that as well.
Well, I actually think it's also about, it's about showing the projects, showing what works. And oftentimes cities are in a position to take leadership on their public lands that show what can work, particularly when there are governance changes that show that an integrated systems approach oftentimes bears a better result. And that's very slow in the coming, depends entirely on the political context. However, the more suffering there is, the more loss there is, the more we start to look at what options do work. And we have enough of those in the toolkit, I would say, that we can show what works in different contexts. To Chris's point with the individual property owners, sure, economic incentive, absolutely. But we're gathering data regularly that show that the investment in what we have called blue and green infrastructures, but increasingly around the world are considered now nature-based solutions or nature-positive development or landscape-led development, so many different terms. But what it means is the combination of soft and hard infrastructures together. One isn't replacing the other, they're complementary. But sometimes, frankly, we're burying the ugly ones and building back beautifully in places that people actually want to live. And when you can show that your property value is increased because of not only the performance of soft infiltrating landscapes and the beautification that happens as a result, but also that there is still infrastructures that we know and trust in the appropriate place. It's just that they're not used everywhere, all the time, rather randomly, right? We're being more site sensitive and more context specific.
Do we have another question? That was really loud, right? Yeah.
Thanks. This question is about resiliency, and as it pertains to the Sanderling cabanas, what would be your recommendation if we could go back in time? How would we address that ahead of them being destroyed?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question if that was to me? I didn't think that was to me.
Who was that to?
That's to you. That's to you, yes. It's Jane, right? Jane. Oh. Yeah, sorry, Jane. The Sanderling cabanas, if we can go back in time, how would you address them before they were destroyed?
Oh, to mitigate or prevent flooding from coming up to them? I mean,
To me, it's about being destroyed. Period. I mean, they're gone. How should we have addressed that if we could go back in time?
well, first of all, documentation, which I think has been an equal message that's been heard, because one of the best things you can do is at least document what was there, to have that baseline. And I know that that's something that Marty has already been working on and is very proficient in doing.
What about landscape? What about landscaping?
There are also a few, because that's so close to the water's edge, right? And is bearing the force of all that wave action. There have been experiments recently with landscape involving, first of all, mangrove restoration does a world of good. Those trees with all their kind of roots exposed and all that, when waves start to hit it, they do dissipate the force. Just off the shore of New Jersey, there's just been an installation which is underwater groins that'll start to dissipate wave action, but they've been designed to create new habitat, right? So living breakwaters is what they're called.
We just doing one too called the reef line.
Yep, exactly. So the idea of going into the water, creating a level of defense is still permeable, and in this case, if you design it properly for the habitat, you can actually increase the habitat value of that property. There are also sand nourishment strategies as well. In fact, oftentimes these things are layered, so that you have one level of force reduction upon a second, upon a third, and they're all reinforcing and working with one another.
And do we know whether they were being maintained? Do we know what the maintenance levels were? They were.
I mean, I think the emphasis that it is across the whole spectrum. You obviously need to be working at the buildings, the material scale, the building scale, but then thinking about what is the defense and protection of the landscape frame in which the architecture sits. And in this case, there is an engineering component to the living breakwaters, of course, but they're emulating a naturally occurring phenomenon that over time, when Chris says it produces habitat, it's also creating a thickly layered gradient of living things that grow upon themselves to actually create and improve that resilience, because they are flexible and adaptive to that space, whether it's mangrove, cypresses, seagrass, eelgrass, and all of the creatures that move in and out of it. It's also food source oftentimes. So we can think about these as multifunctional.
Yeah, I would recommend to speak to the people in Miami Beach that are designing the reef line, which is going to be a large underwater, actually art installation, but designed to support a new reef to prevent a big storm surge coming into the southern part of Miami Beach.
Do we have another question? Oh, got a comment here and then a question.
Would the Sanderling cabanas benefit from, instead of building on land, maybe building on water, like a Maldivian effect, how they build the cabanas on like a dock in the Maldives to tolerate storms, as Sanderling could recreate that entire look, but have it built in the water, right at the water's edge versus on land? Possible? And then organisms like oysters, mussels, and stuff could grow under those dwellings for the ecosystem? I don't know.
Well, in terms of the building components, there's a significant engineering aspect that would have to come into play to building your, I mean, I'm not sure how far down you would have to do pilings to get them to be significantly stable. And Florida's geology is fragile in many areas, and it varies. The thing that I have seen certain homes in Louisiana where they are built on floating foundations. They will rise and fall like a floating dock. However, with something that's a concrete structure, I still would worry that there's going to be some wave action, salt intrusion. I'm not sure, but it would need a serious engineering approach.
And I'm going to add that with our upcoming partnership with the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, we're going to be doing a number of case studies. And I was in conversation with Max Strang. We were looking at pilings, but the idea that the cabanas could have been a potential case study, right, for reinforcement. And I don't want to be flippant about it, but I don't think she's here. Laura Muldowney, at one time when I first started coming to Sarasota, you know, these buildings were experimental and the materials were, and she said the Paul Rudolph buildings are great if we could just move them indoors. That's what she said. Okay, I got another question.
I really appreciate the regional aspect of some of your presentations about blue sky projects. I've worked with USF to do those same type of programs and projects in the urban areas in Tampa and Hillsborough County. And I think they need to be expanded throughout. But my real excitement here today is to see what we can do. I'm a homeowner that's I left my home at 4:30 in the afternoon. I came back at 10 o'clock the next morning, had over 3 feet of water. Everything's gone, stripped down to bare bones, the studs. And one of the things in one of the presentations I really appreciate was building back possibly with Durarock or something to that nature and leaving a gap, an air gap in the bottom where you could put various types of features that you could open up, whether plastic or wood. Do you have any other simple suggestions like that for those of us that are going to go through these reconstruction projects? What smart, simple solutions for resiliency for these structures in the future storms?
Well, first of all, I'd have to defer to Rosa on the terrazzo because one of the biggest things I think is just going through your house and thinking of it in terms of if I had to clean up and I could come in with a hose, what is going to be vulnerable? And look at that area and know, okay, so you know you had, correct me, 3 feet of water. Up to that point, look at what's below and consider what's vulnerable in all manners, and understand that terrazzo is something that can potentially be washed out, and make sure that it is being maintained. I think there are also things like door dams that can enclose small spaces, floorboards, other material, just making sure you're not having permeable materials at the lower levels, and making your furniture on wheels or your heavier equipment able to be moved in and out on wheels. I know that can be popular for more of a commercial restaurant purpose, but also having secondary storage somewhere for personal belongings to be relocated easily. There's a number of kind of easy, low-hanging fruit, things like that. Do you have anything you want to?
Your floors looked great. They were amazing. We couldn't stop looking at them. They looked so good. But that isn't to minimize the amount of work and headache and expense and exhaustion that you've had to put up with. But honestly, apart from what Jenny said about making some of those materials at the lower level as resilient as your terrazzo is, the only thing is to just sort of also have a plan for your belongings that would be, easy to transport or lift up. But one thing also, this is a cautionary tale, that just putting things high onto tables and stuff is not enough, because if the water goes high enough, those tables can float and dump everything. So if you're going to do anything, things have to be anchored. If you're going to keep or sealed containers or gone. But yeah, but it was your house in particularly that gave me that aha moment of, wow, they really knew what they were doing here when they built these houses.
Okay, there's a comment here.
Follow up on the terrazzo. We have like 65-year-old terrazzo, similar experience. It's in pretty good shape, not great. Do they still pour the same quality of terrazzo? Can it still be replaced if you have to replace a room or two?
I have personally not found, and I don't know in this area, but actually in South Florida and Miami. I have not found any company that will pour terrazzo for a residential property. But for the most part, like, holes in it and gouges and stuff are fixable. And one homeowner, I can't remember who it was, we went to one homeowner's house the other day who had actually done their own artisanal repairs to their terrazzo by putting in these fills and just like touching them up with paint on their own. And that's kind of ingenious. It was a kind of ingenious, an ingenious solution because what happened is in the storm, the coating wore away, but the fills looked like they were intact, weren't they, for the most part? I mean, I wouldn't suggest that for outdoor terrazzo, of course, but that sort of was a low tech way of approaching it.
Actually, I can make a comment. Sometimes people forget I actually am trained as a designer, and I did do a renovation of a house, a couple in Gainesville, and they didn't have terrazzo in their 1960s house, but they wanted it. And there are companies that do terrazzo tile that you would see. It's commercial. I had to become a vendor to purchase this for them. But we did the entire house, and it's a terrazzo, but it comes in a tile form, and so you've got options.
We just bought some.
It's a little more expensive, but it's very durable.
Actually, we found it less expensive than the similar square footage of travertine.
Yeah.
And also, people will do epoxy pours. That epoxy modified terrazzo. You can get that done. The problem is it does not really do really well with UV. If you're doing a lighter color, it'll yellow.
So I think they're here. I'm sure if you have other questions, they're happy to answer them. What I would like to say, just a couple of things in wrapping up. Going from this, again, thank you all. Amazing, a round of applause. And again, looking at our two-part mission, really looking forward and that regional scale or urban landscape scale, the study that Chris will lead, looking at our waterfront that'll go sort of from Selby Garden, maybe all the way to the bay. I think we still have to define that study area. But at the same time, we're out there meeting with people, helping provide data and information, like how you recover your homes as you rebuild. One thing I really want to stress, we have a short list of homes that we're going to help prepare letters to get determinations of eligibility for the National Register, which will allow people to put their home back without meeting the 50% rule, right, to let them put it back. But I just want to be very clear in terms of our position is you can't put it back exactly the way it was and expect a different outcome. So the degree that we can provide adaptation guidance, and there's some good stuff out there that we've been talking about, we will do so. And I've known for a long time what I've been asked and think what my role is, but it's our role as an organization that we love Sarasota just like you all do in this room, and our role is to keep you in the place that you love as long as we can. What that looks like is what we're here today talking about, how we're going to figure that out. But again, I just want to stress, these are big, heady topics that we're addressing and the challenges ahead, but there's any community that can do it. I know it's our community. Thank you so much.